In Judea, Roman influence on architecture developed faster and deeper than in Greece or Asia Minor. This was mainly because, aside from a few major Hellenistic cities in the north, there was no widespread Greek-style architectural tradition. Although some Greek elements, like the Ionic order, continued to be used, local styles and techniques remained strong. The buildings at Dura show that older construction habits remained very resilient. Despite the impact of Greek and Persian cultures, much of the architecture Rome encountered in the East was still very local and distinct. One key factor in the architectural changes of the region was the presence of client kingdoms along the eastern frontier. Their rulers depended on Roman support, and some built personal relationships with Rome. The most prominent of these was Herod the Great, who ruled Judea from 37 to 4 BCE. He left a deep mark on the architecture of the region and carried out many construction projects not only in his kingdom, but also in Syria and even distant places like the Dodecanese, Pergamon, and Nicopolis in Epirus. Herod's major achievements include founding the important port city of Caesarea, rebuilding the ruined city of Samaria and renaming it Sebaste, and founding several smaller towns like Anthedon, renamed Agrippeion, Antipatris, Phasaelis, and Gaba, a military colony for retired cavalry near Mount Carmel. He also rebuilt several desert fortresses once held by the Hasmoneans, including Alexandrian, Hyrcania, and Masada, and constructed a new one, Herodium, which he designed as his own tomb. Herod also built temples for Rome and Augustus in Sebaste, Caesarea, and Panion at the base of Mount Hermon. In Jerusalem, he expanded the temple and doubled the size of the surrounding sacred area. He built the Antonia fortress and a palace with halls named after Augustus and Agrippa, protected by 3 towers. Outside of Judea, he built stoas, temples and marketplaces in Beirut and Tyre, fountains and columned courtyards in Ashkelon, theaters in Sidon, Damascus, and Caesarea, an amphitheater in Caesarea, gymnasiums in Tripoli, Damascus, and Ptolemais, baths in Ashkelon, an aqueduct in Latakia, and paved the main street in Antioch. After decades of instability, this large and ambitious building program had a lasting impact on the region. Over the past 20 years, many archaeological excavations have taken place at sites connected to Herod's buildings. Even though not all the results have been published, certain features have become clear. In terms of planning and construction, Herod's architecture was strongly influenced by contemporary Roman design. However, these ideas were adapted using local materials, techniques, and traditions. Concrete-like materials were used frequently. In places like Hyrcania, Masada, and Herodium, vaulted substructures were built to create flat platforms on hills. A notable example is the round vault at Herodium. Large sacred spaces in Jerusalem, Samaria, and Caesarea were also leveled using these techniques. Aqueducts crossing valleys and stairways leading to the temple in Jerusalem were supported by arches. The rare Roman technique called opus reticulatum appeared at Panion and Jericho. Meanwhile, a small dome at Herodium, even though inspired by examples in Campania, was built in a traditional Hellenistic style using cut stone. Other decorative features, like mosaic and colored stone flooring, plaster reliefs, and painted walls, mostly followed late Hellenistic traditions. In Jerusalem, only limited remains from Herod's time survive. Nothing is left of the temple itself, but much of the massive sacred platform remains. This nearly rectangular area measures around 480 by 315 meters, about 525 by 344 yards. It was constructed using large cut stone blocks up to 12 meters tall, with gates and open stairways. The palace foundations remain, and one of the 3 defensive towers still stands up to 20 meters high. In Samaria, even though later builders reused the materials and built over them, the remains of the temple that Herod built in honor of Rome and Augustus are still informative. This structure had a rectangular sacred area, about 50 by 63 meters in size. It was built on a terraced slope and surrounded by colonnaded porticos on 3 sides. On the 4th side stood the Corinthian temple, reached by a long staircase. The temple itself had 3 sides with columns and a flat wall at the back. This layout is also found at other sites in central and southern Syria during the early imperial period. When it comes to theaters, things are less clear. Outside major cities, theater was not a strong tradition in Hellenistic Syria. So Roman-era theaters there were usually Western in style. However, Herod's theater in Caesarea seems to reflect a different influence, and its exact source remains uncertain. Herod is also credited with building the first colonnaded street in Antioch. According to Josephus, he paved the main avenue and added a stoa of equal length. At this time, monumental arcaded streets were just starting to appear in late Republican Rome. The full colonnaded street form, with symmetrical stoas on both sides, came later. But since Antioch was such an important city, it's possible that Herod introduced this feature first. After the Jewish revolts, Judea was reduced to a minor province and only returned to architectural importance in late antiquity, during Constantine's reign and the rise of Christianity. Some synagogues in Galilee from the 2nd and 3rd centuries have been linked to the early basilica form used by Christians. However, these buildings are isolated in both time and place, and the connection is doubtful. They are better seen as neutral architectural types adapted for different uses, not part of a larger architectural evolution. To understand the full development of classical architecture in Syria's coastal regions, one must also consider the Phoenician cities and their surroundings, roughly corresponding to modern Lebanon. In addition to the massive Jupiter temple at Baalbek, many smaller sites and recent discoveries from the coastal cities help give a clearer view of the architectural legacy of this region. The religious architecture in the Roman East had complex origins, closely tied to the long history of local cults. In Baalbek, religious worship originally centered on a trio of agricultural gods. However, during the Hellenistic period, likely influenced by Ptolemaic Egypt, this cult was significantly reshaped. The storm god Baal became associated with Zeus and the young god of rebirth, whether known as Adonis, Eshmun, or Tammuz, was increasingly identified with Dionysus, or Bacchus, a god of personal renewal and life after death. The Romans, instead of establishing standard temples to Rome and Augustus like they did in Gaul or Asia Minor, wisely chose to build around this long-established sacred site. Ancient sources only briefly mention this massive construction. The 7th century historian John Malalas wrongly claimed that the temple was built under Antoninus Pius. In fact, an inscription on one of the temple's front columns shows that construction had already reached the capitals by AD 60. This suggests the temple was likely planned soon after the Roman colony Julia Augusta Felix Heliopolitana was founded around 16 BC. This wasn't the first monumental sanctuary at the site. Excavations in the 1960s, though not fully published, revealed that the grand courtyard platform stood atop an ancient mound. At least 3 older sacred buildings were found buried within this mound, with the oldest dating back to the 6th century BC or earlier. All 3 earlier structures followed the same orientation as the later temple, with one central spot repeatedly reused for altars. A tower-shaped altar, similar to those at Makhnaka and Kalat Fakra, was built in front of the 3rd temple's facade. It remains unclear whether the earlier sanctuary was a true temple or simply a monument with an altar. The altar itself was clearly the main focus. Even during the Roman construction, specific arrangements were made to preserve access to older Hellenistic altars. Like other major sanctuaries in the ancient world, the Baalbek complex took a long time to build and was never entirely completed. Studies of decorative details suggest that the Great Altar was finished by the mid-1st century AD, while the surrounding courtyard underwent several design changes and was only completed nearly a century later. Around the mid-2nd century, the Temple of Bacchus was added, possibly the structure Malalas had in mind. In the following century, a monumental entrance area, the propylon, and forecourt were built, dated by inscriptions and coins to the reigns of Caracalla, 211 to 217, and Philip the Arab, 244 to 249. The Temple of Jupiter in Baalbek was extremely large by any standard, and its high platform made it appear even bigger. This base stood at the top of a wide staircase, rising about 13.5 meters above the courtyard level. Made entirely from finely crafted honey-gray local limestone, the temple featured 10 columns at the front and 19 along the sides. Each column was nearly 20 meters tall, placing the pediment around 40 meters above the courtyard floor. The cella, which faced east, was dismantled in the Middle Ages when the sanctuary was turned into a fortress. However, based on the foundation plan and comparisons with other temples, it's believed that a raised sacred space, Adyton, existed at the western end of the cella, an arrangement later repeated in the Temple of Bacchus in a more complex form. In front of the temple was a porticoed courtyard with an open space measuring 97 by 86 meters. Along its axis, between the temple facade and the original entrance, stood two square tower-like buildings. The taller one reached 17 meters and had flat platforms accessed by stairs. These were likely artificial high places for sacrifices. Interestingly, the larger tower stood so close to the entrance that visitors could not see the temple immediately. Only after turning left or right would they come face to face with its grand facade. Some scholars have interpreted the massive scale of the Baalbek temple as a Roman innovation, or even as excessive display. However, this is not entirely accurate. While its height was exceptional, its ground-level measurements, 48 by 88 meters, were actually smaller than some major Greek temples like the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus or the Temple of Zeus at Akragas. Even in Rome, only the Temple of Venus and Roma built by Hadrian matched or exceeded this size. In design, the Temple of Jupiter shared similarities with Herod's temple at Samaria, suggesting influence from Hellenistic models. Yet its features were also very familiar to Roman observers. Some decorative details were clearly Roman. For example, the earliest column capitals resemble those from the Augustan period, like those on the Temple of Castor in Rome. Another uncommon Roman feature in the east was the shell-shaped niches that opened downward instead of upward. At the same time, other decorations on the main altar tower were purely Roman in style, while some of the geometric motifs show the influence of more conservative Eastern traditions. The entablature, which stood about 4 meters high, had a more complex background. Its proportions and overall style recalled mid-1st century Roman monuments, while elements like the floral decoration on the cyma and the meander patterns below had clear Hellenistic origins. A spiral molding, rare in the West, appears only in places like the Temple of Shamash at Hatra and in some Jewish monuments. The frieze featured alternating lion and bull figures that seemed to support the cornice. These animals were symbolic of the local triad of gods, Baal-Hadad, Jupiter, and Atargatis Alat, Venus. This type of support, known from Persian columns at Persepolis and Susa, and similar examples in Sidon, was part of a long-standing Persian tradition that also appeared at Hatra. The Temple of Bacchus, though smaller than the nearby Temple of Jupiter, 35 by 66 meters, was still impressively large. Its plan stood out, especially in how much space was dedicated to the cella. This likely reflected specific needs of the cult. While the decorations were based on earlier designs, they were remarkably detailed. The interior of the cella was a masterpiece of balanced grandeur. Major architectural elements rose boldly, while smaller details added complexity and richness. Compared to the clean and classical facade of Hadrian's library in Athens from the same era, the Bacchus Temple's interior was far more dramatic. Its style had more in common with the Severan Forum at Lepsis Magna, where shop entrances were integrated into the main decorative plan for added scale. The creative use of recessed surfaces, blurring the line between wall, column, and niche, and the attempt to connect the adyton and the main hall of the cella, even if only partly successful, reflected a broader Roman interest in spatial illusion and theatrical architecture. Local features in Lebanon help us understand the unique interior layouts of its temples. In later and more complex examples, such as the Temple of Bacchus in Baalbek or Temple A in Naiha, the sacred space consists of a raised, domed platform that fully occupies the rear of the cella. This design evolved from a simpler type, where the divine statue was placed inside a small arched niche, edicula, at the top of a staircase against the back wall. The key architectural elements in this layout are the arch and the steps. In contrast to Greek temples, where the statue of the god was usually placed in a quiet, enclosed room, this Eastern design reflects the idea of a god seated in a throne room receiving worshippers. This concept was also expressed similarly in places like Gerasa and Petra in southern Syria. Even though the architectural style of these temples appears classical, the ideas they express are very different from those of the traditional Mediterranean temple. Because of this, Lebanon's small sanctuaries are very helpful for understanding the strong survival of local Semitic traditions hidden behind a classical appearance. They also show that Achaemenid Persian architectural influence lasted much longer than expected. Hellenistic influence is less surprising, but part of it probably spread into the countryside during the Roman period, starting from coastal cities where classical ideas had become more common. Signs of Hellenistic influence include the frequent use of columned, monumental courtyards in temple layouts, the use of Ionic and, less often, Doric orders, and the long, narrow shape of some small temples. The columned upper temple at Kalat Fakra is especially noteworthy in this context, as it may reflect the influence of Baalbek in the 1st century AD, or a shared Hellenistic model. Although the building in its current form likely dates no earlier than the second half of the 1st century AD, the altar in the forecourt still displays traditional Egyptian-style decorations. When Augustus brought peace and prosperity back to the classical world, a wave of classical architectural ideas spread and was clearly visible in Baalbek during the 1st century AD. However, this influence did not last long. More research into coastal cities might provide further detail on this impression. While architects in Rome, during the Julio-Claudian era, were busy applying innovations of the previous generation, in Lebanon, the rest of the 1st century AD was spent blending these new ideas with local traditions. This mixture led to the creation of a unique provincial Roman architectural style, with Baalbek as its central reference point and ongoing source of inspiration. Just like in southern Anatolia, the balance of local architecture during the early empire in Lebanon was disrupted by the introduction of marble. Although the impact may seem less dramatic than in Pamphylia, this is mainly because the geography limited how much new building material affected the most well-known monuments. Still, even in Baalbek, the granite columns of the large courtyard clearly show the attraction of new materials. Although the entablatures on top of these columns were still carved from limestone, they reveal clear signs of a new stylistic vocabulary. In the coastal cities, this influence spread more quickly and widely. In Tyre, the only well-preserved monument from the 1st century is a detailed triple arch located on the landward side of Alexander's Causeway. Built of sandstone and covered in plaster, this structure is a typical early imperial building. Later constructions, like the colonnaded street, bathhouses, and the Heracles Melkart Temple, used imported marble or granite columns, column capitals made of Proconnesian marble, and entablatures following the familiar marble style patterns. The same is true for the colonnaded street and the Nymphaeum, monumental fountain, in Byblos. These are the most significant remains uncovered so far in that city. Although the ancient remains of Beirut lie under the modern city, a chance discovery of a series of long Proconnesian marble capitals, now displayed in the National Museum, is enough to show that by the 2nd century, the dominant architectural style there was influenced by the styles of Western Asia Minor. It's even possible that the building which started this trend has survived in part. This structure was found during excavations beneath the modern Parliament building, though its exact nature remains debated. However, the elegant Corinthian order, reddish limestone breccia columns, and Proconnesian marble details, now partially reconstructed in front of the museum, stand out. Especially interesting are the carved assembly instructions found on each block. A missing inscription from the site records that the building was erected with its columns and marbles by Berenice, sister of Agrippa II, and once a lover of Emperor Titus. This rich context made Lebanon one of the most suitable places for the early development of a new architectural trend that would become common municipal practice in the 2nd century. Unfortunately, very little remains today from the northern Syrian coastal cities, especially from Antioch. Yet this city would have been the perfect place to see monuments that represented the lost architecture of Hellenistic Syria. It also would have shown the strongest examples of successive Roman influences. Even in the list of buildings Julius Caesar had constructed in Antioch, such as a bathhouse, aqueduct, theater, amphitheater, and a grand sanctuary for the imperial and Roman cult called the Caesarion, this influence is already visible. This architectural, we could also observe here the later reverse flow of architectural influence from the east to the west, especially during the late Empire. One of the most striking examples of this is the series of floor mosaics found in Antioch and its suburbs. Unfortunately, only a few small bathhouses and some house remains have survived from this rich architectural past. The bathhouses come in various plans: rectangular, octagonal, apsidal, and rarely circular. The most complex ones can be compared to the hunting baths in Lepsis Magna and likely share the same origins. However, we have no information about their roof structures. Among private houses and villas, the most common type was a single-story house with a central peristyle. Some of these were quite wealthy and decorated, arranged loosely around a few small courtyards. A noticeable common feature was the importance given to the dining room, triclinium, which usually opened to the courtyard through columns or piers, often accompanied by an ornate fountain, and was frequently arranged without concern for symmetry. A house found in the port of Antioch, Seleucia, dating to the early 3rd century, may be an example that later influenced late antique houses in Ostia. As for the monumental architecture in the city, almost nothing has survived. We know from Malalas and other authors that such architecture existed and was significant, but we lack details. We also find little to fill this gap in other northern Syrian cities. Instead, we rely on well-preserved remains from small towns and villages located inland between Antioch and Aleppo. These rural areas supported the infrastructure of major classical cities and give us a vivid picture of what Roman civilization meant for rural populations under fortunate conditions. What makes them especially interesting is that many of the buildings that survive date from the 5th and 6th centuries, a time when civilization was collapsing in many parts of the Roman world. The fact that these buildings belong to a later period is not especially significant in this context, because many non-Christian architectural forms had changed very little since the early empire. Although most of this rural architecture is more important for social history than architecture itself, it still reflects many features of urban architectural thinking of the time. The basic architectural forms in this region were very simple, which was largely due to the abundance of high-quality building stone and a long-standing tradition of working it. Except for the apses and semi-domes in bathhouses and churches, buildings generally had straight lines, with barrel-vaulted or sometimes flat roofs, and often emphasized vertical expansion over horizontal. 2- or even 3-story buildings and towers were quite common. Another frequent feature was the portico, sometimes made with classical details, but more often built as a simple open frame with square vertical and horizontal monoliths. A few buildings more clearly show classical tradition. One is the temple at Burj Bakirha, dated to 161 CE. It is a modest pro-style building with a base and simple inner sanctuary, similar to those found in Lebanon. Another example is a small private bathhouse in Brad, Roman Barad, from the 3rd century. Its curved layout and vaulting clearly reflect Roman metropolitan practice and were predecessors to the small bathhouses of early Islamic architecture in Syria. It was likely built to suit the taste of a wealthy city landowner. However, such buildings influenced by outside styles were rare. Most buildings repeated the basic forms of local architecture. Civil architecture was very prominent in this region because it was built with the same architectural language and durable materials as public buildings. Most of the surviving houses date from the 4th to 6th centuries, but they follow forms already well established during the early empire. The basic unit was a rectangular building, 1 room deep, divided by transverse walls. These structures almost always opened on their long side, usually the south facade, onto a portico. In their local and simple form, roofs were flat and built with narrow spans that could only be covered with weak local timber. The houses in the village of Takle from the 4th or 5th centuries show a modest level of comfort, with living spaces upstairs and stables downstairs. However, even in the 1st century, more spacious and better-built versions appeared, using classical barrel vaults and roof tiles. These wealthier homes, such as those at Banakfur in the 1st century and Benabil in the 2nd, were typically 2-story, with double porticos on the facade and inner courtyards. Around these houses were side buildings with porticos, including a barrel-vaulted hall. One such hall at Me'ez is dated to 29 CE. Even foreign building types like bathhouses were eventually adapted to local use, as seen in the 473 CE bathhouse in Sergila, and those from the 5th to 6th centuries in Babiska. As in many parts of the ancient world, the most personal and expressive architectural forms appeared in buildings meant to honor the dead. These included twin-column monuments, tetrapylon monuments with pyramid roofs, later domed tombs, sarcophagi with gabled roofs placed on tall bases, small temple-like tomb buildings, rock-cut tombs with carved facades, and square towers with high pyramidal roofs. These forms belong to a wider tradition, also found in Syria's Hermel region and in places like Caesarea in Cilicia, and even reflected as far as Italy and North Africa. They show how personal taste played a role in architecture and how tomb architecture defies simple classification due to its great variety. Damascus, with its fertile lands and central position in Syria, has paid the price for its long and prosperous history through the near-total disappearance of its classical monuments. Today, all that remains are parts of a Hellenistic-style grid street plan. 2 Roman colonnaded streets built on this plan, one of which is the Straight Street, mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles, along with the probable locations of the Agora and Theater, and fragments of the Temple of Jupiter Damascenus, located beneath the Umayyad Mosque. The temple was located near the western end of the sacred area, which now forms part of the mosque's outer walls. This sacred precinct was a large rectangular enclosure measuring around 297 by 411 meters, surrounded by double colonnaded galleries. Construction of the temple and precinct began during the reign of Augustus and was largely complete by 15 to 16 CE. The main parts that survive belong to the sacred precinct. Although the design followed classical traditions, especially the grand Corinthian-style monumental entrance, it also included traditional elements such as Egyptian-style decorations and parapets with battlements. This complex gave early hints of features later seen in Roman-Syrian architecture, such as corner towers on facades, rectangular exedras facing the courtyard, and the distinct relationship between the gateway, propylaea, sacred area, temenos, and temple building. It was one of the largest monuments in the Eastern Roman Empire during the early imperial period, and if more of it had survived, we would have a clearer understanding of the development of Roman architecture in central and southern Syria. Even though this overview of architecture from the Syrian coast and its surroundings is brief and lacking in detail, the general patterns are still clear. While we lack much information about Hellenistic cities, which were the main source of classical influence before Rome, it is clear that strong native traditions remained in the countryside. This balance varied across time and place, but Persian, Hellenistic, and local Semitic traditions were still relevant during the Roman period. The earliest evidence of Roman influence appeared in Antioch during the time of Caesar and became more visible during Augustus, especially through the efforts of Herod. Rulers of other client kingdoms along the frontier likely adopted similar styles. Roman influence involved introducing new building types and techniques from both the Greek world and Italy. These elements became Rome's main architectural contribution across different social groups and remained dominant for about a century. Another major shift happened in the early 2nd century, this time driven by the use of marble and inspired by the provincial architecture of Western Anatolia. Seen in this context, the spread of Roman architecture south and southeast toward the Red Sea and the Arabian Desert, and eastward to Mesopotamia, becomes more understandable. While the political history of these regions during the early empire is complex and not fully explored here, it's important to note that at the start of the 1st century BCE, the entire area south of Damascus and east of Jordan was under the Nabatean kingdom, which remained a client state until it was annexed by Trajan in 106 CE. Meanwhile, the rural people of the Hauran region, though connected culturally and economically with Nabatea, were under the rule of Herod and his successors until around 93 CE. East of the Jordan River was a region where Hellenization had begun earlier, and by 63 BCE, it had formed a loose confederation of 10 cities known as the Decapolis. This area is very rich in Roman-era remains. The main surviving sites are Petra, the capital of the Nabatean kingdom, and Gerasa, one of the cities of the Decapolis. During this period, Damascus was probably the main source of classical influence. Petra is romantically located in the almost unreachable Edom Mountains, famous for its rock-cut tombs carved into cliffs. However, the city's central monuments have received less attention. These include an aqueduct, a colonnaded main street, a theater, a large peripteral Corinthian temple, a small prostyle temple with 6 columns, a fountain monument beside the street, similar to one in Gerasa but smaller, public baths, and at the western end of the street, an elaborate triple arch leading into the sacred area of a temple known as Qasr el-Bint, Pharaoh's Palace, which is still the largest standing monument in Petra. The dating of these monuments is debated. The traditional view, supported by many modern scholars, holds that most of Petra's distinctive architecture predates the Roman annexation of 106 CE and belongs to the reign of King Aretas IV at the end of the 1st century BCE and his immediate successors. According to this view, the architecture is late Hellenistic in both character and chronology, inspired by palatial styles found in late Hellenistic Egypt and Syria. These models may also have influenced buildings like the columned palace in Cyrenaica. However, the same evidence could suggest that many of the buildings visible today were actually built after annexation. The more decorative tomb facades in particular may date much later than proponents of the traditional view claim. The writer supports this second interpretation, though early dating still has support among respected scholars. The rock-cut tombs of Petra show a wide variety of details, but their facades follow certain typological patterns. These facades are not based on the layout of the burial chambers inside, but instead use a shallow, almost two-dimensional relief to represent a three-dimensional architectural design. The basic local form is the tower tomb, common in the Hellenistic and Roman East, and also seen in Palmyra. Decoration is usually simple, featuring 2 repeating elements: a stepped crown motif, which later became a simplified double-stepped triangle, and Egyptian-style cornices typical of late Hellenistic Lebanon. In a second stage, classical features like corner columns, simple capitals, small pediments over doorways, and Doric-style triple-panel friezes begin to appear. In the more decorative types, a second story is added, showing a miniature version of a tower tomb in the background, as if standing behind the main facade. All of these forms are also found in the necropolis of Hegra, Medain Salih, in northern Hejaz, a major stop on the trade route south of Petra. 30 tombs there are dated between 1 and 75 CE, showing that these architectural types already existed in Petra at the beginning of the 1st century CE. However, in Hegra, there are no examples of the 3rd stage of development, where classical elements cover the entire facade and the tomb takes on the appearance of a full temple tomb. These types of tombs have 2, or in more elaborate cases, 4 columns, a full-scale frieze, and a triangular pediment. It seems that by the year 75 CE, temple tombs were still not common in Petra. Whether they were already in use before 106 CE is less important, because there was no sudden change in the development process. But based on current evidence, it appears that most of the more ornate temple tombs in Petra belonged to wealthy Roman Nabatean citizens in the 2nd century. The final stages of development continued in a predictable way. New elements such as broken pediments and round pavilions with conical roofs were added to the design. Nabatean capitals, pot-shaped finials, large disc motifs in Doric friezes, and quarter columns on the inner faces of corner pilasters were inherited from earlier periods. What was new was the more advanced scale and detail in how these motifs were carved. This development can be seen as Baroque in character, similar to the third style of wall painting in Pompeii, the marble facades of Western Anatolia, the decorated interiors of Roman tombs in Italy, and the interior designs of temples in Lebanon. These examples evolved from earlier models with both logical progression and influence from past styles. Ornament schemes first seen in late Hellenistic palace architecture reappeared 2 centuries later in a different setting and with different materials. The layout of the Demir Temple is unusual in many ways, but the terraced roof is also found in other more traditional classical temples in Syria, including those at Slem and Es Sanamen. At Slem, the 2 corner towers are at the front, each with a staircase flanking a small porch with 2 columns. Pilasters and columns form a pedimented facade. Above this, the outer pilasters continue upward and support a horizontal cornice that marks the edge of the terrace. In Es Sanamen, the towers are at the back, overside chapels, and the porch is of the more traditional front-columned type. While details vary greatly, once the idea of flat roofs was accepted, we can find examples in smaller temples, and possibly in larger ones, such as the Temple of Bacchus at Baalbek. Other temples with terraced roofs include the Zeus Temple at Qanawat, in the Hauran, the Temple of Bel at Palmyra, the Zeus and Artemis temples at Gerasa, and structures at Datras, Mhai, and Qasr Rabba in the Moab Mountains east of the Dead Sea. The temples at Mhai and Qasr Rabba are also early examples of entrance portico layouts that later appear in Baalbek's 3rd century temples. These terraces were likely used for religious purposes, possibly replacing the tower-shaped altars of earlier times. At first glance, Gerasa feels like a completely different world. It's certain that a local community lived here earlier, likely settled on the hill north of the Forum, across from the Temple of Zeus. But the city was officially refounded between 175 and 164 BCE by the Seleucid king Antiochus IV under the name Antioch on the Chrysohoos. Although this event probably didn't change daily life much, it helped link Gerasa to the cities of the Decapolis, laying the foundation for adopting classical forms. For a while, Rome's presence in Syria had very little direct impact on Gerasa. Since it was outside the territory of Herod and his successors, the Decapolis may have remained isolated from broader developments. The first clear Roman activity in Gerasa was the rebuilding of the Temple of Zeus and its sacred precinct. The original temple began construction in 23 CE and was still unfinished by 70 CE. It was designed in the Ionic order and sat on a high platform accessed by a long staircase rising from a colonnaded courtyard. This setup is similar to Herod's temple in Samaria and early imperial sanctuaries like the one in Baalbek. Another early structure, likely dedicated to the Nabatean god Dushara, was also built in the Ionic style, but was later replaced by a Christian cathedral. Traces of these early buildings are limited. The visible city today was mostly constructed during the 150 years following the mid-1st century CE. The first major step was creating a more ambitious city plan, which included new walls and gates. One such gate, the Northwest Gate, was completed by 75 CE. The city walls enclosed a polygonal area on both banks of the Chrysohoos River. Most of the settlement was built in terraces on the western slopes. A main colonnaded street ran through the city toward the Forum, intersected by 2 transverse colonnaded streets, decumani, that crossed the river via bridges. The streets followed the Ionic order, and some were partially completed. The forum's porticos were also built during this time. The forum itself is an irregular oval space just inside the south gate, between the likely location of the Hellenistic town and the Temple of Zeus. It was likely a market area for caravans arriving from the south. Another major building from this period is the large South Theater, built during Domitian's reign, 81 to 96 CE. It reflects typical Western-style features and is one of the earliest surviving Roman theaters in Syria. The widespread use of the Ionic order in these buildings shows the strong influence of late Hellenistic Syrian architecture. Despite Gerassa's close economic and social ties to the Nabatean kingdom, its architecture leaned more toward the classical world. The real turning point in Gerassa's history came in 106 CE, when it became part of the new Roman province of Arabia. One of the first priorities of the new administration was building high-quality roads. The only monument identified from Trajan's time in Gerasa is the North Gate, which faced the road toward the coastal cities and Pella. Soon after, the city experienced a period of prosperity under Roman influence. Emperor Hadrian spent part of the winter of 129 to 130 in Gerasa. During his visit, a new neighborhood was officially added to the city, though in practice only the new South Gate and a triumphal arch marking the boundary were completed. However, in the following decades, the city layout changed significantly. The Temple of Zeus was rebuilt and ready for dedication by 163 CE. The central and southern parts of the main street were widened and transformed into Corinthian style. Later, one of the main crossroads became a circular plaza with a central four-column monument. The Temple of Artemis and its sanctuary were expanded, with a ceremonial route leading up to it. The sacred area and entrance of the neighboring Cathedral Temple were redesigned, and in 191 CE, a richly decorated fountain building was added between the two. Other buildings from the Antonine period include the North Theater circa 161 to 166, the large Western Baths, a new sanctuary called Temple C, and a festival complex 1 mile outside the city at Berkatine, which included ritual pools and a festival theater. Among all these buildings, the Temple of Artemis, dedicated to the city's patron goddess, was the most prominent and still dominates the city today. The temple measures 22.60 by 40.10 meters and is a large Corinthian structure with 6 columns across the front, a deep porch, and sits on a podium 4.32 meters high. Staircases beside the entrance indicate that behind the traditional pedimented facade was a terraced roof. Inside, the floor of the cella rises westward toward the adyton and a niche in the back wall for the cult statue, showing that height was a key design element. The temple stood in the center of a rectangular sacred precinct, measuring 121 meters wide by 161 meters deep. This area was surrounded on 3 sides by porticos, and on the 4th by a large entrance building with a full-width portico, reached by a wide staircase. Small towers or pavilions were added to each side of the portico. This arrangement closely resembles the layout seen 50 years later at Baalbek. The temple's craftsmanship is refined but not flashy. Its impact comes from its commanding position and the rising rhythmic procession route leading to it. The path began at a bridge over the river and continued up a sloped ramp to a triple-arched gate. Beyond that was the east propylon, followed by a short colonnaded street and another arch. From there, 7 stairways of 7 steps each led to the forecourt. The far end of the court was completely filled with a grand staircase of 27 steps, stretching over 100 yards, about 91 meters, leading up to the propylon entrance of the sanctuary. Though the temple could be seen from afar, it was only fully revealed after entering the sacred enclosure. This kind of staged approach recalls, in a different context, the approach to St. Peter's Basilica in Rome before the opening of the Via della Conciliazione. The entire ceremonial path was designed to heighten the impact of the final view. The rebuilt Temple of Zeus closely resembled the Artemis Temple in layout, but was larger and had 8 columns across the front. The main difference lay in its more elaborate details. The inner walls of the cella had pilasters, while between the outer columns were deeply recessed niches framed in the style of ediculae. These ornamental features were typical of 2nd century architecture in both Gerasa and the Hauran, and again point to strong connections with Baalbek's architecture. Temple C was much smaller and had an unusual plan. It was built on a former burial ground and stood in the middle of a rectangular sacred area, 65 by 50 feet, about 20 by 15 meters, surrounded on all 4 sides by porticos. The temple had a porch with 4 columns projecting from the center of the 4th side. The cella had a T-shaped layout, with a square sanctuary opening into a transverse hall. Because this plan is similar to the Hellenistic Hieron at Calydon in Aetolia, it may have been built as a commemorative monument to an important citizen. But in this context, it is more likely that it reflects a slightly more elaborate version of the T-shaped temples found at Dura and Hatra, or of Petra's Qasr el-Bint, representing a local form given a surface-level classical appearance. Despite the enthusiasm for classical styles, native architectural elements still remained deeply embedded in the structures. The West Baths in Gerasa are particularly impressive for the quality of their stone vaults. These buildings contained 3 separate domes in the form of half-spheres that cover square rooms. These may be the earliest known examples of such domes in Syrian architecture. While some claims about the Eastern origins of this kind of design have been exaggerated, similar domes were being built across the empire at the time, in concrete in Italy and in mud brick in Egypt. This shows that the use of such domes was common in Roman architecture. What really mattered was the materials and construction methods. In this case, the plan followed a typical Western layout, with a symmetrical arrangement around a 3-part frigidarium. However, the construction techniques were adapted to local building traditions. Another clear example of Mediterranean influence in Gerasa is the Nymphaeum, built in 191 CE along the main street, or Cardo. Its central semicircular exedra and flanking wings were decorated with double rows of columns, framing rectangular and curved niches. The lower columns were covered with green Carystian marble imported from the Aegean, and the exedra was topped with a half-dome made of soft volcanic tuff. Similar decorative fountains were also built in coastal cities. For instance, a typical marble nymphaeum of the same period exists in Byblos. A closely related structure is the large Severan-era nymphaeum in Lepsis Magna, Tripolitania, which is nearly identical except for the missing half-dome. Another elaborate example can be found in Philadelphia, modern Ammon, next to the main street, and yet another in Pella, where the fountain was so iconic that it appeared on the city's coins. The 2nd century building boom in Gerasa was not unique to that city. It was part of a wider wave of prosperity that spread throughout the region after Arabia became a Roman province. This prosperity continued for about a century, ending with the military disasters and political instability of the mid-3rd century. Petra showed some of these effects, and now we turn to another southern Syrian region, Hauran. Interestingly, some of the most important architectural examples in Roman Syria were built in Hauran before the region became a Roman province. As in the rural areas of northern Syria, Roman civilization made a strong and lasting impact once it arrived. However, this impact had a provincial flavor. Outside of Basra, the capital, most local villages were turned into small rural towns under Roman rule. These towns are of great interest to social historians, but their influence beyond the region was limited. What set Hauran apart was the local Nabatean population's strong artistic ability. Through contact with the more advanced cultures of the Hellenistic East, they had developed a unique architectural style. Although this style was influenced by other cultures in form, its spirit and technical skill were original and powerful enough to leave lasting marks on all of Roman Syrian architecture. One of the most remarkable structures from this early period is the sacred site of ancient Syea, now Sai, located in the mountains northeast of Basra, near Qanawat. According to inscriptions, this sanctuary was built in the final decades of the 1st century BCE, shortly after Hauran came under the control of Herod the Great. At that time, a ceremonial road led to a triple gateway, which opened into the first of 2 long, narrow, rectangular courtyards. These were designed for sacred ceremonies. The first courtyard had colonnaded terraces on both sides, and at the far end stood the Temple of Dushara, facing left. This temple had a simple plan, a square cella within a square outer wall. Its front was open in the center and framed by 2 projecting wall sections with columns between them. The inner cella was enclosed, while the outer corridor was open. A striking feature of the façade was a horizontal cornice that arched upwards between the central columns. From the outer courtyard, an elaborately decorated gate led into the inner sanctuary, which was surrounded on 3 sides by porticos, and on the 4th by the Temple of Baal-Shamin, which resembled the Dushara temple but was more decorated. It had a low pediment and was flanked by 2 small towers. The roof of the cella, like that of the Dushara temple, was likely supported by 4 interior columns. In a later period, the sanctuary was expanded outward, and a southern temple with a traditional 4-column facade was built in a new courtyard, accessed through a grand arched entrance. It's rare to find such a vivid example of multiple influences coming together in a Syrian border region. The architecture at Sai was clearly supported by the stability provided by Roman rule, but the design of the early temples was unfamiliar to classical ideas, just like the deities they were built for. The square within a square plan was common across Nabatean sites, such as Khirbet et Tanur, and sites like Sur and Sar at the northern edge of the Ledja, and is thought to have originated in Iran. This theory is supported by the discovery of although the square plan design was later replaced in Hauran by more classically influenced columned temples, many later buildings, like those in Mayamaz and Breka, still reflect its proportions, much like Petra's Qasr el-Bint. The overall layout of the sanctuary, with its axial and enclosed organization, resembles temple complexes of Hellenistic origin in central Syria. Many architectural details also reflect these roots: column arrangements, semi-classical designs, elaborate door frames, and features like the triple gateway with its clearly classical bases and lintels, although often so heavily decorated or adapted that they are hard to recognize. Nonetheless, classical decorative motifs like egg and dart, wave, chimation, meander patterns, and palmette pediments are present, along with other elements similar to early Palmyrene ornamentation. These Palmyrene features are convincingly linked to Parthian models. The variety of grapevine motifs is particularly striking. Some styles commonly seen in Phoenician coastal cities and early Petra, like stepped pediments and Egyptian cornices, are absent here. Instead, we find Persian-style column bases with inverted leaf patterns. One of the first specific signs of Petra's influence is the use of Hegra-style capitals in a late four-columned temple, which likely dates to the final years of Nabatean independence. The quarter columns of the outer gate, thought to be from an even later period, also seem directly inspired by Petra's rock-cut facades. The earlier classical elements likely came from Herod's northern territories. Interestingly, Ionic capitals are absent in these buildings. The early examples, like those in Palmyra, are based on free interpretations of the Corinthian order from the Hellenistic period. Although the architecture of Sai might seem somewhat barbaric, it was highly creative. Three architectural features from here went on to influence areas far beyond Nabatean territory. One was the Syrian arch, a curved feature rising from the center of a cornice, possibly the earliest known example in a classical context. Another was the use of twin towers to frame a facade. Both features became important in classical and medieval Christian architecture. The third was the small acanthus leaf ring placed between the base and shaft of a classical column. This detail, first seen in Ptolemaic Egypt, later spread to places like the Arch of Hadrian in Gerasa, into the marble craftsmanship of Asia Minor, and to monuments such as the Temple of Venus Genetrix in Rome, the Fountain House in Nimes, and the Severan Basilica in Lepsis Magna. It's believed that the grapevine motif entered classical architecture through this same channel. Despite limited resources, the architecture of Si was shaped by intense creativity. On a local scale, this architectural approach set the tone for the next 100 years. After the establishment of the new Roman province, prosperity spread throughout the region, bringing more classical architectural types into Syria. However, these newcomers encountered already established building methods and craftsmanship, creating a blend unique to Romano-Nabatean architecture. The common building material in the area was hard volcanic basalt. Though difficult to work with, Nabatean builders developed exceptional skill in handling it. Since suitable timber was scarce, roofs were usually built using intersecting arches, and long stone slabs were laid between them. This system became common in homes, temples, such as the Third Temple at Sai, and public buildings like the 2nd century Basilica at Shaka. An alternative roofing method used in early buildings at Sai involved placing roof slabs directly onto closely spaced columns. This approach, which may go back to Achaemenid Persian models, is visible in both early temples at Sai. Another common method involved crossing arches, and both systems can clearly be seen in the Praetorium at Mizmieh. A different kind of roof, one not found in local tradition and more directly linked to Roman influence, was made from concrete vaults using volcanic tuff stone. This technique first appears in the late 2nd century in the entrance hall of a large public building in Shaka known as the Palace. It can be compared to the 191 CE Nymphaeum at Gerasa. But these kinds of constructions only became widespread during the reign of Emperor Philippus, 241 to 245 CE, when he founded Philippopolis, modern Sheba, his hometown, and built a large Roman-style bath complex there. In this bath, rectangular vaulted halls. Elsewhere in Haran, for example at Shaka, domes were built over square rooms using long stone slabs set diagonally from corner to corner. These domes were not spherical, but pointed and elliptical in shape, just like the dome of the Church of St. George in Zora, built in 515 CE. A similar but larger building was the St. George Cathedral, built 3 years earlier in Bostra. Along with concrete vaulting, a new type of masonry also appears. This involved rough stone blocks filled with mortar at the core. a construction technique that resembles rubble-filled masonry from Asia Minor. When used in the baths at Philippopolis and Bostra, it shows that this building method probably developed from Roman concrete traditions brought in through coastal cities. Despite basalt being a tough stone to work with, Nabatean builders showed great skill and creativity in carving it. Decorative details were sharply cut, often set in striking contrast against flat, plain surfaces. The decoration included motifs such as key patterns from the pre-Roman period, but these were carefully adapted to classical style, even within the constraints of the material. The Corinthian order was widely used, though Ionic elements were also present, like in the colonnaded street of Bostra and the temple at Hebron, dated to 155 CE. Some temples even combined different styles, as seen in Atil and Slem. A key feature shared with mid-2nd century architecture in Baalbek and Gerasa was the use of decorative ediculae, small niche structures used to ornament facades. These often had shell-like niches that widened towards the top and are found in places like Atil, Hebron, Es-Sanamen, and Shaka. In the Hauran region, examples of linear ediculae also exist, like in the temple at Sueda, sometimes dated as early as the 1st century BCE. However, it's more likely that this structure was built under Herod's successors, when classical and local traditions began to blend. The temple was almost square in plan, had a semi-Corinthian layout, with 8 columns on the sides, 6 at the front, and 7 at the rear, a unique feature later repeated only in the peripteral temple at Kanawat, built about a century later. This temple had Corinthian columns placed on tall fluted bases. While 3rd century decoration became more formal and academic, few new motifs were introduced. The marble style seen along the Syrian coast had little influence inland. Real marble use was limited to places like Bostra and Philippopolis, and even there, it was only used for surface decoration. Aside from the more elaborate terraced and peripteral temples, most other temples were fairly small. Some had facades featuring the Syrian arch, while others did not. These small temples were either 4-columned, such as the fragmented remains of Deir el-Meshkuk, Breka, and Mayamas, dated to 124 CE, or of the in antis type, like the ones at Atil, 151 CE, Mushanef, 171 CE, and Hebron, 155 CE, the last of which had a more unusual layout. Other public buildings are mostly found in Bostra and Philippopolis. Bostra had been designed by Trajan to be the new provincial capital and had a grid plan with narrow columned streets. Several arches and gates stood along these streets. Among them was the East Gate with a Nabatean-style capital, probably dating to Trajan's reign. A fountain house placed at a street corner was similar to the one in Gerasa, but adjusted to a sloping location and featured a Syrian arch facade. The southern baths at Bostra were structurally very similar to the baths at Philippopolis from around the same period and clearly showed Western influence. For example, the entrance hall had a round or octagonal shape within a square plan with apsidal niches in the corners, an Italian-style layout. This form had been used earlier in Herod's Winter Palace baths at Jericho and was still found in the Bath C in Antioch. Though the concrete vaults in these buildings were inspired by Western models, they eventually developed a unique local character. Lightweight volcanic stone allowed for unusual forms such as a wide, shallow, octagonal dome of 45 feet diameter and a square dome of 30 feet with a central oculus. A wide-fronted cryptoporticus, covered walkway, was also likely influenced by Western architecture. The impressive 2nd century theater in Bostra followed a mostly Western design with a skenai fronds featuring 3 apses and a columned gallery at the top of the cavea. The plain architectural style chosen for this building was developed even further in the theater at Philippopolis a century later. That later theater had Bostra wasn't just the capital of the province, it was also a garrison city for the Legio III Cyrenaica, as was common in frontier regions of the east. Two important buildings from this military function still survive. One is the so-called basilica, a large, well-lit hall, likely part of a larger 3rd century complex. Unusually, it had a wooden roof built using traditional methods. A single concrete vaulted apse stood at one end, and the hall opened onto a long colonnaded courtyard or street. Along the exterior, porticos extended under the windows. This general layout closely resembles ceremonial reception halls, such as the Basilica of Constantine in Trier. In Hauran, just like in northern Syria, porticos were used occasionally, but they were not a native architectural feature. Houses tended to be inward-facing, often grouped around irregular shared courtyards. In rare cases, like in Medjol in southern Hauran, these layouts were organized into regular rectangular shapes, resembling Roman city blocks, possibly imitating urban planning. However, the overall settlement patterns were generally more organic. Clusters of buildings developed around narrow streets and open spaces, much like traditional layouts still seen in many eastern towns today. El Jamal and Busan are well-documented examples of such settlements. In the Mesopotamian frontier region, Dura Europos and Hatra offer unique insights. Dura, originally named Europos in Greek, was founded around 300 BCE by Nicanor, with settlers from Macedonia. After the breakup of the Seleucid Empire, it came under Parthian control around 140 BCE. It briefly came under Roman occupation during Trajan's reign, then returned to Parthian hands until the 160s CE, when Rome took it again. Around 200 CE, Emperor Septimius Severus turned Dura into an important military outpost, but in 256 CE, it was attacked, captured, and sacked by the Sasanian king Shapur. The site was abandoned to the desert, and later Emperor Julian reportedly hunted lions among its ruins. Though never a major city, Dura was located at a key strategic point on a natural highway along the Euphrates, connecting Seleucia and the Persian Gulf to Antioch. This gave it importance during times of crisis. In peacetime, it was an important stop on caravan routes across the desert, linking with cities like Palmyra and Hatra. What makes Dura unique is that it is the only border town in the region that has been excavated thoroughly enough to show how it grew and functioned, offering valuable insights into its social and cultural dynamics. The first strong impression from the site is how shallow and short-lived the influence of Greek architecture was. Aside from basic elements like columns and door frames, the only lasting Greek legacy was the city's grid plan. Streets intersected at right angles, forming blocks, insulae, about 70 by 35 meters, standard in Seleucid city planning. Early builders used Greek materials and techniques, such as stone foundations, which remained in use even when later constructions reverted to local traditions of mud brick and plaster. The last Greek-style project was the rebuilding of the Sanctuary of Artemis, locally called Nanaia, but it was never completed. Planned as a small peripteral temple, it was soon replaced before 32 BCE by a more ambitious and Eastern-style structure. Over the next 2 centuries, more than 8 similar temples would be built. The brief life of Seleucid Greek architecture in Mesopotamia is summed up in Dura's Agora. Originally planned to cover 8 insulae at the city's crossroads, the Agora would have included double rows of shops and colonnades. It was the only building with a sloping Greek-style tiled roof, but only half of the plan was completed. Over time, the space filled with randomly built shops and narrow lanes. By the 2nd century CE, the agora had become a crowded, irregular marketplace. In the final Roman phase, some effort was made to restore order with porticos and a small central square, but overall, the Greek design had faded, replaced by the liveliness of an Eastern-style bazaar. Before the Roman garrison was established, most surviving buildings in Dura were houses and temples rather than official structures. Homes were single-story, with flat roofs, and rooms arranged irregularly around small courtyards. This layout closely resembled domestic architecture in Hatra, a principality under Parthian control located about 180 kilometers northeast of Dura. The temples also strongly resembled those in Hatra. A typical temple plan consisted of a transverse hall ending in a small sanctuary chamber, where the cult statue stood, located at the center of the long wall opposite the entrance. Often, there were side chapels flanking the main sanctuary. This design became popular in southern Syria and later Christian architecture. The Dushara temple at Gerasa, with its T-shaped sanctuary, may follow this tradition. In both Dura and Hatra, central temples were placed within courtyards, surrounded by smaller chapels, altars, treasuries, and housing for priests. Sometimes classical elements were added to these temples. At Dura, a four-columned porch was added to the Temple of Bel, and another temple for Palmyrene gods in the 3rd century. An old city tower blocked the addition of a second side chapel. But such classical touches, like the Greco-Roman names of the gods, were superficial. These deities were actually of Babylonian, Mesopotamian, Arabian, North Syrian, and Phoenician origin. Their temples and worship practices reflected local frontier traditions. Jewish and Christian communities adapted regular homes for their own religious needs. The Mithraeum for the cult of Mithras was also distinct. Though the Mithras religion came from Iran, it was introduced by the Roman garrison and originally practiced in a room of a private house. It was later rebuilt and enlarged, and its architecture reflected the needs of a universal, multicultural religion rather than local styles. When Septimius Severus set up the Roman garrison, nearly a quarter of the city within the walls was taken over for military use. This included barracks, officer housing, a headquarters facing a colonnaded street, a training ground, several bathhouses, a small amphitheater, and a formal residence for the commander of the Euphrates frontier, Dux Ripae. This residence, added just a decade or two before the city's fall, had an impressive architectural design. Built on a rocky slope beside the river, it was arranged around a rectangular courtyard flanked by 2 short wings, with an apsed dining hall at the center. The commander's private quarters were at one end, and a small bath complex at the other. Behind this was a large inner courtyard surrounded by service rooms, servant housing, stables, and reception spaces. Behind this was another courtyard with 2 monumental entrances and a large hall clearly meant for public ceremonies and legal duties. Like other officer residences and the main Roman headquarters, this layout followed Western models and introduced Roman architecture into the city. Similar buildings are found in the West. Local materials and building practices added features like flat roofs and arched facades, giving the complex an appearance reminiscent of 20th century Italian colonial buildings in Libya. But everything else, from layout to measurement system, was Roman. Even the units used followed the Roman foot instead of local Semitic measurements. In Dura, most of the roofs were built using wooden beams transported down the river. Ceilings were made by covering reed frameworks with plaster, and sometimes they were shaped to look like barrel vaults. In some cases, real vaults made from mud brick or baked brick were used. These bricks were placed vertically, in line with Mesopotamian building traditions, not radially as in Roman architecture. Because such vaults are less likely to survive, They were probably more common than archaeological evidence shows. This technique later spread from Syria into Anatolia, and vaults made of baked bricks eventually became standard in Byzantine architecture, especially in Istanbul. Dura gives us a vivid picture of a world that was neither fully within the Roman Empire nor entirely outside it. Its architecture isn't directly part of classical development, but it helps us understand the hidden cultural and structural realities beneath classical-looking surfaces in parts of Syria influenced by Rome. The city's wall paintings and sculptures hint at artistic elements that would later shape the shared visual language of the late classical world. Dura was a meeting point between classical and Iranian cultures. Many religious and artistic ideas that later influenced late antique architecture were first developed here. Palmyra was located in the Syrian desert, nearly halfway between Damascus and Emesa on one side, and the Euphrates near Dura on the other. Thanks to its abundant water supply, the city had a major advantage. The clever use of this resource, combined with Rome's stable rule in Syria, allowed Palmyra to rise as a major trade center. By organizing and protecting caravan routes, the city offered traders involved in the luxury trade between Asia and Rome a safe and direct passage to Phoenician ports. In the 3rd century, with Rome's eastern military power weakened, Palmyrene rulers like Odenathus and his wife Zenobia established control over Syria, much of Anatolia, but this brief period of glory ended in disaster when Emperor Aurelian captured and looted the city in 272 CE. Afterward, it became merely a legionary fortress under Diocletian's new frontier system. Palmyra's architecture followed traditional rules, but expressed a bold and provincial classicism. Despite strong ties between Dura and Palmyra, their architectural styles were surprisingly different. This contrast wasn't only due to Palmyra's closer political ties to Rome and better building stone. It also reflected deeper historical differences. Although Dura had been a Seleucid colony, local Semitic influences soon overpowered the Greek settlers. In contrast, Palmyra was a relatively new city with no major pre-Roman monumental tradition, except perhaps connections to Seleucia on the Tigris, the key Hellenistic city controlling its trade. Evidence from late Hellenistic architectural fragments in Palmyra shows a highly imaginative style, filled with non-classical elements. Similar styles are seen not in nearby cities, but in distant Hellenistic settlements, like Iconium, Gandhara, and Mathura. Pre-Roman Palmyra belonged to an Eastern world that leaned toward classical forms, yet remained distinctly non-classical in spirit. In the early 1st century CE, a clear shift in style occurred, seen in the Temple of Bel, one of the city's earliest surviving buildings. Like the Temple of Jupiter in Baalbek, it took a long time to finish. It was placed inside a square courtyard surrounded by porticos. The west portico opposite the entrance was higher and included a monumental gateway. Within the courtyard, 2 altars stood on either side of a central axis, along with a large pool for ritual purification. The temple was dedicated in 12 CE. The 3 lower porticos were added later in the 1st century, the west one during the reign of Hadrian or Antoninus, and the Grand Gate in the time of Marcus Aurelius or Commodus. The original temple was built in Greek style on a stepped platform, but when the sacred enclosure took final form, this platform was turned into a low podium. From the outside, the temple appeared classical, with 8 columns and a surrounding colonnade. However, the entrance was slightly off-axis on the long side and featured a complex doorway between 2 columns. Above the classical cornice, there was a stepped parapet similar to old Persian battlements. The classical look was only skin deep. Behind the triangular pediments were flat terraces, not sloped roofs, reached by stair towers at the corners of the cella. Inside, there were two small shrine rooms at each end, accessed by long stairways. Between projecting staircases, shallow domes were carved into the ceilings. In one dome, Bel was shown at the center of the sky. Though the meaning of this unusual layout remains unclear, it likely reflects local worship traditions expressed through classical forms. What stands out is that even in the 20s CE, Roman influence had reached this distant region and inspired such architectural experimentation. Like the Temple of Jupiter in Baalbek, the Temple of Bel reflects new political realities in architecture. But while Baalbek shows direct Roman influence, Palmyra drew more from the architecture of Antioch in the late Seleucid and early Roman periods. Palmyra's later architectural development followed a predictable path. The Corinthian capitals used in the Temple of Bel, built in 32 CE, still show Hellenistic creativity while staying close to Vitruvian classicism. But by the late 1st century, a fully classical approach had taken over, much like in Baalbek. Although Palmyrene sculpture remained Eastern in style, the city's architecture during its golden age was strongly connected to the architectural trends of Roman Syria. The first thing that amazes visitors to Palmyra is its colonnaded streets. Yet Palmyra was not unique in this regard, nor the first to use the style. The colonnades on the city's northeast street date to the late 1st century, but the main avenue, 11 meters wide and 1.2 kilometers long, was built in the 2nd century. The middle section was added in the 3rd century. The eastern end, meant to connect to the Temple of Bel, was never completed. Directional changes along the route were cleverly hidden by various architectural tricks. One example is a monument formed of 4 columned pavilions placed on square platforms, similar to structures in Gerasa or the Harbor Gate at Ephesus. Recent excavations revealed fountains with curved apses and facades of 4 columns extending beyond side porticos. A unique feature was the use of outward protruding hooks on the columns to hold statues, a more orderly and aesthetic solution than randomly placed sculptures. Though seen in places like Apamea in Syria and Pompeiiopolis or Diocesarea in Cilicia, this practice was never used on such a large scale elsewhere. The theater and agora, both built in the 2nd century, were badly damaged when the city was hastily fortified in the 3rd century. The theater followed a Western academic layout. Its main feature was the colonnaded street around its outer edge, offering shade and rest areas for spectators. The agora, from Hadrian's time, was a square courtyard with columns and a basilica-style hall on the east side. Though basilicas were common in the Western Empire, they were rare in the East. In this case, the building may have served as a Kaisereion, linked to the imperial cult. Other surviving structures include the temples of Nabo and Balshamin, remains of some houses, a public bathhouse, tower tombs, and a military headquarters built under Diocletian. The Temple of Nabo faced south and followed the typical Roman-Syrian style. It had a Corinthian order, 6 columns, and stood on a high podium in a trapezoidal sacred enclosure surrounded by columns. In front of the stairs was a large square altar enclosed by columns, and beyond that, a monumental gateway. The main sanctuary was rectangular, with a raised platform at the north end and stairs leading to a terrace. Stepped battlements lined the top of the side walls. The temple was built in the 2nd half of the 1st century. The surrounding porticos, unusually in Doric order, were added at different times throughout the 2nd century. The Temple of Balshamin appears classical from the outside. It has a deep front facade with Corinthian columns and half columns attached to the back and side walls, creating the effect of a 4-column front. This temple was a relatively late addition to an older sacred area. In the northeast corner of this complex, there was an open, nearly rectangular space that already existed by 17 CE. Over time, this central area was expanded with porticos and, before 33 CE, transformed into a peristyle courtyard. A small roofed temple was added in one corner. Finally, in 130 CE, the original sanctuary was rebuilt as a peristyle courtyard in the Rhodian style. The existing temple building dates to that same year, while the peristyle courtyard to its southwest was built between 137 and 179 CE. One unusual feature of this 2nd century temple is the presence of large windows on both sides of the cella walls. This is not a classical architectural element. Like temples in Lebanon and southern Syria, this design suggests that the building was considered a dwelling place where the god lived and found peace. The temple complex had a richly decorated sacred area based on Lebanese models, featuring a central chamber with an apse and 2 side chapels accessed through diagonal doorways set at an angle. The bathhouse built during Diocletian's time followed a very conservative plan. It was arranged around a central columned courtyard with rooms in different shapes. One was octagonal, while the others were rectangular. The houses found in the city followed the typical Hellenistic layout with a central peristyle courtyard. The tower tombs created a more somber and personal atmosphere. Architecturally, they may not be very impressive, but they remind us that this type of funerary monument came from an ancient Eastern idea that had spread throughout the Roman world. Other types of tombs included underground graves with detailed paintings and carvings, or above-ground structures shaped like classical temples with triangular pediments. By the time of Diocletian, what remained of the city was turned into a garrison town. Soldiers lived together with the local population within greatly reduced city walls. In the southwest corner, the so-called Camp of Diocletian served as the main headquarters. Like the contemporary military camp at Luxor, it was designed around 2 colonnaded streets, intersecting at right angles. At the center was an open courtyard, with military offices to the west, and a chapel for the legion's standards in the middle. Although its layout came from typical early imperial army camps, like the one at Lambesis, the structure also shared many features with contemporary civil buildings, like the palace at Antioch or Diocletian's palace in Split. Ancient Eastern countries had many differences, but they usually responded to classical culture in similar ways. However, this was not true for North Africa. During the Roman period, North Africa was home to 3 different ancient civilizations. In Egypt, even though the Greek culture of the Ptolemies had become refined, it never fully replaced the strong traditions of the 2,000-year-old Pharaonic heritage. In Cyrenaica, eastern Libya, local tastes remained loyal to the styles of Greek cities. The rest of North Africa, west of the Gulf of Sirte, had long been under the influence of Carthage's trading empire. Although Carthaginian rule left little visible impact on art or architecture, it helped form a shared culture from Tripolitania to the Atlantic coast of Morocco. After Cleopatra's death, Egypt became part of the Roman Empire, but was treated differently from other provinces. Due to political concerns during the late Republic, Egypt was ruled directly by an imperial governor, rather than a Senate-appointed one. This setup reflected early Roman fears about the East becoming too powerful, a concern that later came true during the reign of Constantine. Rome saw Egypt as unique, an ancient land with deep roots that resisted full assimilation into classical civilization. Throughout the classical period, the architecture of Upper Egypt stood out from that of other Roman provinces. Traditional materials like cut stone and mud brick continued to be used, and architectural styles remained mostly local. For example, when the people of Philae wanted to honor Augustus in 13 to 12 BCE, they built a small classical-style temple. But nearby, the so-called kiosk from Trajan's time, about a century later, still followed the traditional Egyptian form. Even the Arch of Diocletian, built in 296 CE, though it had a classical shape, didn't fully embrace its spirit. Roman influence could still be seen in some areas. At Dendera, 2 small classical fountains stood along a processional road. A Roman-era house in Edfu had a private bath, and the camp of Diocletian at Luxor was built almost inside a pharaonic temple complex. One of the temple halls was even converted into a church, and later into a chapel for the legion standards. The camp's layout, with its colonnaded streets and central 4-column monument, was fully classical. These examples show that Roman architectural styles, although limited in Upper Egypt, were passed on to both Christian and pagan cultures. Still, in the bigger picture, Upper Egypt stayed on the margins of Roman architecture. Some sites are important not because of unique design, but because they were carefully excavated. In the Fayum region, places like Karanis and Soknopayu Nessos had mud brick houses built with little wood or stone. These give rare insights into building materials and methods that were widely used across the Roman world, but rarely preserved. Barrel vaults and shallow domes built without wooden scaffolding even point ahead to features of early Byzantine architecture. In contrast, Hellenistic cities in the Nile Delta had a very different character. Most of Roman Alexandria has vanished, creating a major gap in our understanding, similar to what happened with Antioch. Although texts describe buildings like the Pharos Lighthouse, the famous library, and a large 1st-century synagogue, they are not reliable sources for studying architecture. Still, surviving fragments suggest that Roman Alexandria kept many decorative Hellenistic elements, but also included Italian features. Roman-style baths and a high-platform Ionic temple at Ras el Soda are good examples. Many column capitals and ornaments made of Proconesian marble also show that Alexandria was influenced by the same cultural networks as southern Anatolia, Syria, and North African port cities. One lost building, the Caesareum built by Caesar in 48 to 47 BCE, may have looked like a large enclosed temple complex with porticos. Some scholars believe it was inspired by the temple complex in Hermopolis Magna, built in honor of Ptolemy III and Berenice. That complex had classical details, but an overall layout based on pharaonic traditions. Alexandria's Caesareum seems to have played a major role in shaping the architecture used for the imperial cult across the Roman world. A similar transformation happened in Cyrene, where a 2nd century BCE gymnasium was later rededicated to Augustus as a Caesareum. If this was the same building once known as the Ptolemaion, then the change was both simple and meaningful. The structure was a 51 by 81 meter rectangle with Doric porticos around it. One long side had rooms that were later turned into a basilica, with a large semicircular apse at one end. A temple was added in the center during the 2nd century CE. Many cities in the Greek world had basilica-style complexes, and at least one in Palmyra was linked to the imperial cult. Other good examples were found at Cremna and Smyrna. This architectural tradition likely influenced Rome too. The Porticus Divorum, built by Domitian, was dedicated to deified emperors, and many imperial forums followed similar enclosed layouts. The first of these forums gave the prime space to a temple for Venus Genetrix, the divine ancestor of the Julian family. Caesar may have taken ideas from his recent visits to Alexandria and Antioch when designing this forum. If so, one of the Roman Empire's most widespread architectural forms, the imperial forum, was the result of earlier Hellenistic influences. All later known Caesarea were built in the eastern provinces and included basilicas, showing how a Western building type had been adopted in the East. This was likely due to the prestige of Trajan's Forum and the Basilica Ulpia in Rome. Egyptian culture and luxury materials fascinated Romans of all social levels. A famous mosaic from Praeneste, made around 80 BCE, shows a colorful Nile scene full of animals and Egyptian life. It reflects the decorative tastes of the Ptolemaic court. While later artworks were more stylized, this Egyptian-inspired style remained popular in painting, plasterwork, and mosaics during the Roman era. Obelisks, sphinxes, fountains, and statues were also popular. Augustus started this trend by bringing two large red granite obelisks from Heliopolis. One was placed in the Circus Maximus, the other became a giant sundial in the Campus Martius. Over time, 42 obelisks were transported to Rome by different emperors. This trade was closely tied to the popularity of Egyptian deities like Isis and Serapis, whose temples were filled with original and copied sculptures and decorations. Finally, Egypt's quarries became major suppliers of luxury building materials. These included red granite from Siena near Aswan, imperial porphyry from Gebel Dokkan, and gray granite from Mons Claudianus. Massive monolithic columns, some weighing up to 300 tons, were shipped across the Mediterranean for buildings like the Flavian Palace, Basilica Ulpia, the Pantheon, Baalbek's Great Courtyard, and the Severan Forum at Lepsis Magna. Egypt's stone sources were among the most important in the Roman world, alongside those of Greece and Anatolia. During the Roman period, Cyrenaica was a poor province, especially compared to Egypt. It was rich in historical heritage, but not in impressive Roman buildings. Cities like Cyrene, Ptolemai, and Apollonia have been well excavated, but only a few Roman structures of importance beyond local use have been found. One exception is the Caesareum in Cyrene, which kept its Doric design, showing the city's conservative character. Even during Hadrian's rule, when the Apollo Temple was rebuilt after being destroyed in a major Jewish revolt, the Doric style was still chosen. The Grand Corinthian Order only appeared later, during Trajan's time, in the large public bath built in the sacred area of Apollo, or possibly restored by Hadrian. The bath's columns had marble-style capitals imported from Anatolia. Although such imported designs influenced some local buildings in Cyrene during the 2nd century, they were not as common or powerful as in the eastern or central Mediterranean coastal provinces. Cyrene stayed close to Athens culturally and commercially in the later Roman period. Most of the marble brought into the area came from Athens. Because of this, future studies may find more architectural links between Cyrene and mainland Greece. Ptolemais was a coastal city built in the Hellenistic period and shared cultural tastes with Apollonia, Cyrene's harbor. In domestic architecture, these cities were more open to Hellenistic Alexandria's influence, especially as wealth increased after the establishment of Augustus's peace. A key example is the so-called Palace of the Columns in Ptolemais. It was a rich private house that covered most of a large rectangular block. The house was built in terraces to fit the natural slope of the land, with rooms at different levels. Above the main courtyard was a second floor, a design reflecting the vertical construction common in crowded cities like Alexandria. The house followed a late Hellenistic style with a main courtyard, peristyle, a large private room, oecus, on the south side, and a larger public meeting room on the opposite side. This room had a columned gallery inside, similar to the architectural style seen in Rome during the late Republic. Other rooms and service areas were grouped around a smaller second courtyard. Later, a bath complex was added on the north side, below street level, behind a row of shops. The decoration was very rich, including mosaic floors, cut marble tiles, opus sectile, and carved ornaments made from soft local stone covered with plaster. Decorative features of this building included heart-shaped corner columns, a mix of Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian elements, and different levels placed side by side. Columns also rose from bowls decorated with acanthus leaves, a motif from the Ptolemaic period that spread to Syria and other regions. Arches rose from the ends of horizontal beams, architraves, and fake window-like features, false porticos, had Doric beams supported by Ionic half-columns. Small temple-like niches with triangular pediments stood on their own, surrounded by mini colonnades. These decorations were very similar to the imaginary architecture found in Pompeii wall paintings. Although the exact date is unclear, this house is considered a fine example of sophisticated late Hellenistic domestic design, which influenced decorative tastes across Roman Italy and the Mediterranean provinces. This kind of style was typical for houses in Cyrenaica and stood in contrast to the more traditional public buildings. It was found throughout the province. In Ptolemais, other early imperial houses with similar but simpler features have been identified. The House of Jason Magnus in Cyrene is another example, though with a freer layout. Similar craftsmanship has been seen in Tuchira, Tokra, and Apollonia. One public building in Ptolemais, probably first used as an odeon or council hall, bouleuterion, had a very simple stage with 3 doors leading directly to the orchestra. Later, a full stage was added to turn it into a theater, and eventually the orchestra was made waterproof to hold water games, a common practice in late antiquity. In Cyrene, one orchestra was carved deeper into the rock to form a small amphitheater. The city had 4 theater-like structures in total, and some were clearly meant for public meetings. The hippodromes in Cyrene and Ptolemais show the region's fame for horse racing. Ptolemais even had 2 more theaters, and, unusually for the east, an amphitheater. When traveling west of the Gulf of Sirte, one enters a region quite different from Egypt and Cyrenaica. The Greeks never settled successfully here. From Tripoli to Cadiz, Sardinia, and western Sicily, Roman culture came not from the Greeks, but from the Carthaginians. People here mostly spoke Latin, not Punic or Berber. If Cyrenaica can be called part of the Hellenistic East, then the lands west of Tripolitania, what we call Roman Africa, clearly belonged to the Western world. Even 13 centuries of Arab rule couldn't erase this distinction. Roman Africa has a huge number of surviving monuments. Classical civilization left a strong mark here, and the region's later peaceful history helped many ancient cities and buildings to survive. Still, most of these structures are important not for their artistic originality, but as records of a vanished culture. The architecture remained mostly imitative. This may be due to several reasons, but one major cause lies in the early history of the region and its people. When the first Greek and Phoenician colonies arrived, the native populations of North Africa were still living at a Stone Age level. The Greeks brought with them a vibrant and expanding artistic culture, especially in Cyrenaica. In contrast, the Phoenicians, though skilled craftsmen and open to foreign influence, created very little that was artistically original. Their colonial art and architecture, especially in the West, have only recently received attention, mainly because they lacked creativity and color. This was particularly true by the end of the pre-Roman period, when Eastern influences had faded, and Hellenistic art from southern Italy and Sicily became the main source of inspiration. With Roman rule, a new civilization developed that followed classical styles on the surface, but often ignored local traditions. However, anyone studying the history, language, and institutions of Roman North Africa quickly sees that this culture was just as much Romano-Punic, or Romano-African, as it was Roman. Ignoring this would separate North African art from the everyday life and thinking that shaped it. We know a lot about the early growth of two of the three cities that gave Tripolitania its name: Lepsis, or Leptis, Magna, and Sabratha. Both were first Carthaginian trading posts. Excavations show that Sabratha began as a seasonal trading station by the sea around the 5th century BCE. Lepsis was founded even earlier, though the earliest remains now visible date to the time of Augustus. A formal city plan was made, with a public square, forum, and a gently curving main street that followed the rising ground to the west. Buildings in the old forum were later rebuilt or decorated, but when a newer, more impressive forum was built elsewhere, the original one kept its early imperial appearance for much of the pagan period. Among all similar sites in North Africa, this forum offers the clearest picture of early Roman architecture. The northeast side is slightly diagonal, probably because it followed older Punic structures. The rest of the layout is a perfect rectangle. On the northwest side are three temples. The smallest, called the North Temple, was first built around 5 BCE to 2 CE, and later served as a model for the Temple of Rome and Augustus, built between 14 and 19 CE. Both temples used the same gray limestone, preferred in Lepsis for over a century. They had columns only on 3 sides and showed strong Roman influence, using Ionic capitals and heart-shaped corner columns instead of the usual ones. These features appeared again and again in early Roman buildings in Lepsis. The source of these features may not have been traditional Greek styles, but rather later Punic architecture. So, even though the temples look classical, their style may have come indirectly. The Temple of Rome and Augustus also had detailed vaults, 2 inner rooms, cellas, and a high platform, podium, with twin staircases, rising directly from the forum's pavement. This podium design was similar to the Temple of Venus Genetrix in Rome. Many other temples in North Africa had similar platforms, such as those at Altheburos, Gigthis, Sabratha, and Timgad. In this case, the carvings of ship prows on the podium clearly show that it was also used as a speaker's platform. Another common feature in early imperial buildings in Tripolitania was the use of wood instead of stone for horizontal beams, architraves. Next to the Temple of Rome and Augustus was the Temple of Liber Pater, dedicated either to Dionysus or the Punic god Shadrap. This older temple was built before Augustus's time, using soft sandstone covered with plaster. Across from these two temples, a basilica called Basilica Vetus was added before the middle of the 1st century. It was placed horizontally to balance the large temples, but had a layout similar to long basilicas from southern Italy, like those in Pompeii or Corinth. The main entrance opened onto a small side square across from the Curia. However, the central forum only became monumental around AD 53 to 54, when limestone porticos were built on 3 sides and the ground was covered with large limestone slabs. Later additions included a walled space with a temple of Cybele, built in AD 72, a Trajanic temple later turned into a church, and a small shrine honoring Antoninus Pius, built in AD 153 at the western corner. The Curia, or City Council Hall, was located outside the forum, across from the basilica's entrance, following an older alignment. It was built like a temple and surrounded by a portico, probably dating to the early imperial period. Like in Sabratha, its seating followed the Roman Senate model, with 2 long rows of low steps. The old forum of Lepsis Magna, like the Agora in Corinth, shows how Roman architects could create harmony over long building periods by using a consistent city plan and materials. While the style may have come from classical southern Italy, it also had roots in late Punic traditions. The architecture reflected the solid civic values of the local merchant elite. The donors of the buildings had Punic names like Idibal, Balathon, Baalyaton, and Bodmelkart. The officials responsible for dedicating the buildings were still Punic city rulers, called suffetes, and inscriptions were written in both Latin and Neo-Punic. This community quickly adapted to the opportunities of the peaceful Augustan era. Lepsis grew quickly. Even before Augustus's death, the main street had been extended 250 meters southwest, forming the start of a new neighborhood with a grid layout. By AD 27 to 30, the city had expanded another 400 meters to the southwest, eventually reaching the site where the Arch of Septimius Severus would be built. Important monuments from this time include a market built in 8 BCE and a theater from around AD 1 to 2. These stood on the edge of the developed area. In AD 11 to 12, a columned front called the Chalcidicum was added to hide irregularities in the city layout. The market was a fine example of a misellum, like those in Pompeii. It had twin pavilions in the center of a rectangular open area. A portico was added around it between AD 31 to 37. The southeast pavilion was rebuilt in marble 2 centuries later, but the other pavilion kept its original Augustan structure. Made of elegant gray limestone, it had a round central room with windows and was surrounded by an 8-sided portico. Like the early temples in the Old Forum, the corners had heart-shaped piers. There were no separate shops. Instead, counters were placed between the columns and along the outer walls of the porticos. Despite later changes, the theater kept most of its original Augustan features. The seating area, made of gray limestone, still survives. The stage's column decorations were replaced with marble in the late 2nd century, but the stage layout, with a large central curved niche, apse, and 2 smaller side niches, was unique. This design gives us clues about the early development of Roman imperial architecture. Other features include a Temple of Ceres Augusta with 4 columns at the top of the seating area, a columned foyer behind the stage, a colonnade around the upper seating, and a decorated orchestra floor with painted plaster. In the 2nd century, this floor was replaced with marble, but the original design was similar to the colorful plaster floors in Herod's theater at Caesarea. The architecture of Lepsis during Augustus's rule remained mostly unchanged throughout the 1st century. Decorations became more detailed over time, and Corinthian styles slowly replaced Ionic ones. However, even in grand public buildings, local gray limestone remained the main material until Trajan's time. During Hadrian's reign, marble imported from Greece, Anatolia, and sometimes Italy began to be used. With the marble came craftsmen trained in Greece and Rome, and the change was dramatic. The first major building using marble was the Hadrianic Baths, a large symmetrical complex based on Roman bath plans. Still, it used concrete vaults less than similar Roman buildings. After Hadrian, no new building was constructed without imported marble, and many older structures were remodeled to match the new style. This included porticos, the main temples of the Old Forum, the Curia, the market, the theater, and the Chalcidicum. Lepsis lost its local uniqueness almost overnight. Columns were now imported pre-made. Bases, capitals, pediments, and other parts were carved according to standard designs, often by foreign workers who sometimes signed their names. Later, local workshops developed and added some personal style. But all of this happened within the larger imperial artistic tradition that included places like Anatolia and Syria. The new architecture was not always original, but it was grand and expensive, reflecting the pride and prosperity of the time. Besides the buildings already mentioned, Other early structures in Lepsus included small temples, triumphal arches, an aqueduct, cisterns, harbor facilities, an amphitheater, a hippodrome, small bathhouses, a large training ground, and various porticos, fountains, and public toilets along the streets. Together, these showed that similar developments happened in many coastal cities of North Africa, though early details are rarely so well preserved. In Sabratha, for example, the local sandstone crumbled easily and had to be covered in thick plaster, which required constant repair. So by late antiquity, very little of the first-century city remained. Lepsus was luckier and also richer than most cities, so it expanded faster in early times. Architecturally, Lepsus stood apart from its neighbors mostly because, like rebuilt Carthage, it had a regular city plan. In other cities like Hippo Regius, Tipasa, Thuburbomaius, Thuga, and Gigthis, Roman plans and monuments were placed over older, less organized settlements. To see a well-documented example of urban development in Roman Africa, we can return to Sabratha. At first glance, the Forum seems to have a clean rectangular shape next to the harbor, but excavations show that it was created by organizing a previously irregular open space that had been used as a market before Roman rule. From above or on a map, the old irregular street plan is still visible in the busy area between the Forum and harbor, and along both sides of the main road that runs inland and connects to the east-west coastal road. Farther down this road, the city blocks become more regular. A truly organized grid plan only appears in the late 2nd century, in a new district built to the southeast, near the theater. This contrast is also clear in nearby Gigthis, though in more developed towns like Thuga, monuments were added within the existing city as space allowed. Sabratha's Forum was first built in the mid-1st century AD using plastered sandstone. It had a long rectangular open space with shops on both sides and, near the eastern end, a large Liber Pater temple decorated with colorful paint. Behind the shops on the western half of the south side stood a basilica. Unlike the one in Lepsus, this basilica followed the Vitruvian type seen in central Italy. It was symmetrical around a short axis and had a rectangular apse at the far end that served as a chapel for the imperial cult. The only other major structure in the Forum was a small temple outside the northwest corner, likely from the Augustan period. It stood on a low platform with steps leading up to a box-shaped building wider than it was deep, placed in the center of a columned courtyard. Even though Roman names and styles were widely used, local religious traditions remained strong, and temple architecture continued to be one of the few areas in Roman North Africa that showed real originality. For the next 3 centuries, all the buildings in the Forum, except the Liber Pater temple, which was intentionally preserved and rebuilt using traditional materials, were completely or partially reconstructed with imported marble. One major development from this period was the construction of the Capitolium, a large temple at the west end of the Forum. Like in other Roman cities, it symbolized Sabratha's growing urban status. In the Forum's western half, rows of shops were removed and replaced with 2 long porticos decorated with red Egyptian granite columns. The eastern half was enclosed on 3 sides with a 2-story Hellenistic-style portico, featuring Doric columns on the outside and Ionic columns on the inside. A new curia, council hall, was built facing the basilica on the northern edge. An early temple in the northwest corner was rebuilt in a more classical style. 2 new temples were also added just south of the Forum, one on each side of the main street. One was dedicated to Marcus Aurelius between AD 166 and 169. The other was built a few years later. The Capitolium followed a standard Roman plan, with a podium that rose vertically and acted as a speaker's platform. On the front facade, There were square projecting rooms on both sides of the entrance porch. The two new marble temples were built in Italian style, raised on high podiums and set against the rear wall of rectangular courtyards. Side porticos of these courtyards ended in apses connected to the rear wall. A similar layout was used for the Temple of Hercules, built in AD 186 in the eastern quarter of the city. This temple was dedicated to Melkart, a Punic god. The most striking monument in Sabratha, however, was the theater built at the end of the 2nd century. Its importance lies not in any unusual feature, but in the fact that its stage building was discovered almost complete and carefully reconstructed. This allowed the columned facade to be appreciated in full scale, something that cannot be properly conveyed through drawings alone. The only missing elements are the wooden coffered ceiling and the marble wall coverings behind the columns. Although Sabratha was wealthy, it was not a large city, so such a grand theater is quite surprising. With a diameter of 92.60 meters, it is one of the largest surviving theaters in North Africa. For comparison, the theater in Lepsis measures 88.50 meters, and the one in Hippo around 99 meters. The stage design closely follows that of the Lepsis theater, but Sabratha's theater has more elaborate substructures under the seating area, cavea, including a surrounding outer corridor and an external wall with low-relief triple-column decoration. Features reminiscent of the Theater of Marcellus in Rome. The housing and commercial architecture of Sabratha is remarkably well preserved and deserves a much more detailed study than this brief summary can offer. The irregular layout of the old town blocks reflects the complexity and variety of an area that was continuously inhabited for centuries. Shops, homes, workshops, and storage spaces were tightly packed along narrow streets. Shallow columned arcades provided shade and supported overhanging upper floors, with staircases indicating access to these levels. The ground floors were built of well-cut stone, while the upper floors were made from timber and mud brick. The rarity of roof tiles suggests that roofs were flat in the Eastern tradition. Both interior and exterior walls were covered in plaster. In better preserved homes, painted plastered vaults, decorative stucco work, mosaic floors, and even marble paneling were common. In a newly built district from around AD 180 to 190, rectangular city blocks repeated this same layout in a more organized way. Random colonnades in the old district gave way to orderly facades with columned fronts on one or more sides. Outside the city, there were several peristyle villas owned by the wealthy. A shared feature of Sabratha's houses was the presence of large cisterns for collecting rainwater. There was also a public water system, which delivered water via aqueducts, mainly to fountains and bathhouses. These fountains were both functional and decorative. Public toilets were often placed near bathhouses and were washed by the outflow of this water. Designed for communal use, these toilets could seat up to 60 people on stone benches and were often richly decorated with marble and statues. An example of this is found in the Hadrianic baths at Lepsis. Wastewater, including domestic and rainwater, was carried away through large underground drainage systems built beneath the paved streets. Indoor plumbing was limited to the most luxurious homes. One example is a small private bathhouse, decorated with mosaics and known as the Oceanus Baths, located in a seaside villa on the city's eastern coast. Most citizens used the large, irregularly planned bathhouse overlooking the harbor. There were also several medium-sized bathhouses that served paying or privileged groups. One of these, the hunting baths in Lepsis, may have belonged to a guild that supplied wild animals to Roman amphitheaters. Its good state of preservation up to the top of the concrete vaults supports its classification as a typical early 3rd century Roman structure. Although concrete was not native to North Africa, it was effectively used here to recreate Roman-style architecture. This usage was clear and practical, something rarely seen even in Rome. Its architectural model likely derives from small bath buildings in Hadrian's villa at Tivoli. However, the interior was simplified to create a contrast between geometrically shaped rooms without excessive decoration. The outer walls honestly reflected the layout of the interior spaces. To a conservative Lepsis citizen, raised on the formal grandeur of the Hadrianic baths, the hunting baths might have seemed unusual. Still, the practicality of vaulted construction led to its widespread use in North African bath architecture. Although the vaults themselves rarely survive, the hunting baths allow us to confidently imagine how such structures once looked. Another example of this type is the bath complex at Thinai in Tunisia. There, buildings were organized around a central domed frigidarium, with barrel-vaulted rooms extending in 4 directions and small domed rooms at each corner. Outside North Africa, such vaulted structures were more common than classical architecture texts might suggest. Examples include the Capito baths in Miletus and baths in Bostra and Philippopolis, where the vaults were clearly exposed. Early Arab bath builders also followed this classical tradition. Although no such examples survive in Rome, it is likely that even there, major imperial baths featured externally visible domes. This has significant artistic implications, especially for buildings like the Baths of Caracalla. Lepsis, already one of the wealthiest cities in North Africa, also had the distinction of being the birthplace of Emperor Septimius Severus. During his reign, the city was enriched with a new monumental quarter. This included a walled harbor, a bathhouse, a colonnaded street, a forum, a basilica, and a monumental fountain at the center. Another major project was a triumphal arch with 4 openings. Though this arch was built hastily and stands out more for its elaborate sculpture than for its architectural design. The rest of the buildings were of exceptional quality. The harbor was a roughly circular basin, about 400 meters in diameter, with lighthouses and signal towers at the ends of 2 breakwaters. Warehouses with columned fronts and 2 temples lined the quays. A colonnaded street about 450 meters long and 21 meters wide ran from the harbor to the square near the Hadrianic Baths. On the southeast side of this street stood an unexcavated bath complex, while on the opposite side were the Severan Forum and its basilica. Most of these buildings were constructed from hard, yellowish local limestone cut into large blocks, generously combined with imported marble and granite. For more functional or curved elements, walls were built using rubble and mortar, faced with neat small stones and reinforced with brick or timber supports. The forum itself was a rectangular open area, around 60 by 100 meters. In the southwest corner stood a temple dedicated to the Severan family, built on a double pedestal at the top of a broad staircase and fronted by 8 massive columns. It was entirely made of Proconnesian marble and decorated with red granite columns. The same lavish treatment extended to the surrounding colonnades, which featured green Charistos marble shafts and white Pentelic marble capitals and bases. Along the southeastern edge, wedge-shaped shop rows faced the colonnaded street. In the northeast, another row of shops cleverly masked a directional shift in the transition from the forum to the basilica. The basilica was a huge hall with an apse at each end. The central nave was 19 meters wide, flanked by side aisles with galleries above them. Including a shallow clear-story level, the total height exceeded 30 meters. A double-column arrangement around the apses, a decorated entrance on the northeast side, and ornamental columns in front of the shop row opposite the temple gave this basilica a distinctive look. Notable features of this architecture included the liberal use of tall bases to elevate the columns, elegant lotus and acanthus capitals seen along the forum and street, the replacement of traditional horizontal beams with arches, small acanthus leaf rings placed between columns and bases, and the emphasis on height, refinement, and fine stone craftsmanship. The colorful marbles and deep-cut ornamental designs added to the richness of the entire complex. It is strongly believed that all these buildings were designed by a single architect. Part of the area was gained from a stream bed that passed through the city, but most of the space had to be adapted to the irregular street fronts that already existed. The unity of the plan was achieved through architectural solutions that reflect a unique personal style. For example, the corner chapels of the basilica and the wedge-shaped shop blocks between the basilica, forum, and colonnaded street show such deliberate adaptations. One of the best examples of this problem-solving approach is the main square. The architect faced a challenge at the junction where three different directions met: the road to the theater, the colonnaded street parallel to the Hadrianic Baths, and the new colonnaded avenue. Initially, he planned a circular square at this junction, but this safe and somewhat bland solution was abandoned during construction. Instead, he designed a large and impressive fountain building placed symmetrically between the two colonnaded streets, creating a new visual axis. A typical Roman-trained architect would likely have imposed a straight, symmetrical layout on the terrain, similar to the major imperial forums in Rome. But the architect at Lepsus chose a more sensitive approach that embraced the landscape's irregularities. His hand can also be seen in the harbor's design. The eastern breakwaters steps, the sloping dock platforms, and the rising colonnades contrast elegantly with the soft slope of the sea walls. This was architecture on a grand scale, yet it was executed with lightness and finesse. There is no doubt that the architect was a foreigner in North Africa. Inscriptions on the masonry and carved details, possibly made by his assistants, suggest that he and his team came from northwestern Anatolia, the Greek-speaking world. The types of bases, the stonework on the forum and basilica, the colonnaded street, the screen-like fountain, and the ornamental carvings all show distinct Anatolian characteristics. The lotus and acanthus capitals are Attic in both style and material. The small acanthus ring between the column and its base is a feature seen in Egypt and Syria, but also present in Anatolia. Colonnaded arcades, used a century later in Diocletian's palace at Split, had already appeared in Hadrian's great temple at Cyzicus. In this architectural complex, the only truly Western-style elements were the basilica and the temple. The architect was clearly tasked with following Roman models, especially those of Trajan's forum and basilica, but the materials, methods, and style he used reflected his own background and education. Considering all of this, the Severan building program in Lepsus can be seen as the logical peak of the artistic and commercial ties established in Tripolitania over the previous 75 years. In form, like other imperial or marble-style architecture, the Severan Basilica was quite traditional. It continued the same spirit found in the Ulpia Basilica, the last great flower of the Greco-Roman tradition. Yet, the buildings of Severan Lepsus also pointed toward the future. This city, developed under imperial patronage, no longer followed strict regional boundaries. It was an early sign of a broader trend that would grow in the 3rd and 4th centuries. A style of architecture no longer Eastern or Western, but fully imperial. Despite their traditional appearance, the Severan buildings at Lepsus contained the seeds of the creativity that would blossom in late antiquity. Lepsus and Sabratha were cities shaped by Roman architecture, but they already had their own urban heritage before Roman influence. To understand how Roman urban life was introduced in places with little or no earlier settlement, we must look further west, to Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco. Cities like Timgad, ancient Thamugadi, and Gemila, ancient Quikul, show another side of Rome's success in Africa, equally important but quite different in character. Timgad lies on the high plains of Algeria, about 110 kilometers south of Constantine. It was founded by Emperor Trajan in AD 100 as a colony for retired soldiers. The new permanent base of the 3rd Legion was at Lambasis, only 24 kilometers to the west. Timgad's position was chosen to control one of the mountain passes to the south. Colonies like this served another purpose too, spreading Roman civilization in its Greco-Roman urban form. This idea, more than military logic, shaped Timgad's architecture. As often happened in frontier provinces, the design likely relied on the experience of active or retired military architects. The remains of Lambasis, a site that looks more like a city than a military base, support this theory. Timgad was built on gently sloping ground with access to ample water. Its layout was a textbook example of a rectangular grid based on a square measuring 1,200 Roman feet, about 355 meters on each side. The square was divided into 12 equal blocks in both directions, although the final row to the west was never built for unknown reasons. The only deviation from perfect symmetry was the north-south street, Cardo, which ended at the city center where it crossed the east-west street, Decumanus. Beyond this point, the land rose, and key public buildings were placed there. The city was not large, about 10 hectares, but by the end of the 2nd century, it may have held 12,000 to 15,000 people. Except for the Forum complex, the theater, some small bathhouses and streets, nearly the entire area was reserved for settlers. Houses were originally single-story and modest, with simple floor plans arranged around internal courtyards. Familiar taberna-style shops lined the main streets, which were eventually given colonnaded walkways. The temple platform was extended at one point to create a speaker's platform. Interestingly, only one temple was planned from the start. On the east side of the Forum was a large rectangular basilica, 15 meters wide, with decorative pilasters along the long walls and a raised court area at the south end. Public offices stood on the east side. On the west end of the Forum, a smaller rectangular hall, lined with marble and separated by steps and a columned screen, was the meeting place for the city council, or curia. In the northwest corner near the temple was another small hall, but its purpose is unclear. The Forum's long north side had colonnades and shops built on a terrace over shops, and a large public toilet that opened toward the main street with a wide, decorated front. This Forum was not only the administrative center of the city, but also its commercial and social heart. Its overall layout was based on Italian models, yet showed remarkable flexibility in adapting to local conditions. The basic elements were an open stone-paved square surrounded by colonnades, plain flat-roofed basilicas, as in Timgad, Quikul, and Madoros, or columned basilicas, as in Tipasa, Sigus, and Thubersicu Numidarum, a curia with a vestibule and richly decorated hall, official temples, buildings for archives or treasury, a public speaking platform, and various fountains, niches, statues, and shrines. In Timgad, these elements were arranged on a gentle slope, giving variety to the plan and offering a clear example of what small African cities were expected to include in their centers. Founded under Trajan, the colony expanded rapidly, adding many public buildings in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. These included a Capitolium, several small temples, The Capitolium was probably built in the late 2nd century, just outside the old city's southwest corner, facing the city diagonally. It was very large and impressive by local standards. The temple stood against the rear wall of a wide sacred space with 6 Corinthian columns at the front. The columns were over 9 meters tall and placed on a vaulted platform reached by 2 sets of stairs. Inside, there were 3 chapels, one for each god of the Capitoline triad. With all these features, Timgad's Capitolium was thoroughly Roman and might even have been modeled after a now-lost example in a famous coastal city like Carthage. Timgad's Arch of Trajan belongs to a group of monuments that originated in Rome but soon developed a distinct North African style. Across North Africa, from simple arched gateways with shallow pilasters, like at Verecunda, Marcuna, near Lambaesis, to elaborate 4-way arches like those in Lepsis and Tebessa, arches of every type and complexity were built. Timgad itself has 3 others, one built between 166 and 169 in honor of Marcus Aurelius on the road to Lambaesis, another built in 171 on the road to Mascula, east, and the third, the North Gate, Cirta Gate, finished in 149, which features pilasters and half-columns on each corner. These North African arches can be classified by their number of arches, framing elements, use of freestanding columns, and so on. Decoration often reflects available funds and taste more than date. The Arch of Trajan in Timgad definitely predates the Severan period, but likely not by much. Its closest comparisons are with arches from the Severan period at Lambaesis and the Macrinus Arch at Diana Veteranorum, Zana, built in 217. The most distinctive feature of Timgad's arch is the curved pediment design around small temple-like niches above the side arches. Marketplace buildings, or macella, were originally Italian in design and likely reached Africa very early, possibly even during the Carthaginian period through Sicily or southern Italy. The market at Hippo Regius had 2 main parts, an outer rectangular courtyard with columns and an inner courtyard surrounded on 3 sides by permanent market stalls in the Pompeian style, with a central circular pavilion. Similar types of macella, with or without outer courtyards or pavilions, can be found in many African cities. These often included a statue or shrine of the god Mercury, the deity of commerce, and played an important role in everyday urban life. One of the 2 markets at Timgad, called the Syrtius Market, was built in the 3rd century just outside the Arch of Trajan. It was an ambitious project. After passing through an irregular entrance courtyard, visitors entered a rectangular inner court surrounded on 3 sides by colonnades and lined with shops along the facade. At the far end, a taller row of columns supported the pedimented front of a semicircular hall with an apse, around which 7 small shops were arranged in a radial layout. This curved design created a refreshing contrast with the strict rectangular planning typical of Trajan's time. The most surprising feature, though, was the series of high, narrow arches standing on individual square entablatures inside the courtyard, like architectural brackets, creating a very unusual effect. The East Market, located within the Old City and built at a later date, had an even more unusual plan. Behind the colonnaded outer passage was a market section with a semicircular entrance space flanked by rows of shops. Beyond this area were 2 small, intersecting inner courtyards, each with apses and surrounded by stalls. Here, the architect had to fit a complex design into an already defined city block. The result may seem awkward, but the boldness and intent behind the design make it notable. A similar experimental spirit was seen in the library donated by a wealthy citizen during the 3rd century. The solution was to place a long, apsed hall between two rectangular rooms at the back. The building was entered through a shallow, colonnaded rectangular forecourt and surrounded by reading rooms or offices. Along the curved wall of the main hall were niches between projecting columns for storing scrolls, with a central niche holding a statue of the emperor or a protective deity. Although some elements, like the connection between the apse's half-dome and the rest of the roof, seem uncertain, the overall design shows a reasonable blend of old and new forms. By the 3rd century, waves of new metropolitan architecture were reaching even remote and peaceful provinces of the empire. As elsewhere, bath buildings played a major role in spreading these new ideas. The North Baths, built in the 3rd century, measured 60 by 80 meters and were compact, rectangular, and symmetrical across the short axis. Their design clearly followed the great public baths of Rome. The first African example of this imperial bath style was probably the Hadrianic baths in Lepsus, built in AD 123, followed by the very original Antonine baths in Carthage around 143, with hexagonal hot rooms set in a complex interlocking layout. That massive building was over 200 meters long, richly decorated with mosaics and imported marble, and likely influenced bath architecture across Africa. Other examples include the 183 baths at Quiquel, baths at Utica and Uthina, the Severan-era baths at Caesarea, Churchill, the Licinian baths in Thuga from the Gallienus period, the Great Baths at Lambesis, and an unfinished complex at Lepsus, likely from the mid-4th century. The Caesarea and Thuga baths show how this type could vary in form, one being large and geometrically rigid, the other a flowing, intricately designed plan using curved lines and columned arches, similar to the Severan Forum at Lepsus. Though simpler in design, the bathhouses in Timgad were spacious, practical, and well used. They were also the only buildings in the city fully faced with brick, suggesting the work of a specialized architect brought in for the project. The South Baths, built in the mid-2nd century just outside the southern gate, stood on an irregular plot and differed greatly from other examples. They followed a more common circular layout, with hot and cold rooms arranged around a central core. While individual rooms showed some symmetry, the exterior did not. In older cities, such baths often disappeared among crowded housing blocks, as in the summer baths at Thuburbo-Maius, but usually they stood partly or fully detached. Architects then had two options: either give the exterior a grand, formal look, as seen in the Great Baths at Medoros, or, as in the case of Timgad's South Baths, creatively use the awkward site. The architect rotated the building's rectangular frame 45 degrees against the street grid and filled the corners with boldly projecting apses and curved exedrae. If the bath chambers were vaulted and the exteriors of the vaults left exposed, like at the hunting baths in Lepsus, the effect on Timgad's conservative citizens must have been quite impressive. Quiquel, modern Gemila, located about 70 miles northwest of Timgad, appeared very different at first glance. While Timgad lay on a flat plain, Quiquel clung to the northern edge of a narrow triangular plateau between two deep valleys, limiting the possibilities for urban planning. Yet the two cities represented two opposite poles of Roman town planning. Quiquel may have lacked Timgad's urban order, but it had a livelier, more daring architectural style. A deeper look, however, reveals many similarities. This is no surprise. Quiquel, like Timgad, was a military colony, founded just 3 years earlier in AD 96 or 97 to control an important road through the Kabylie Mountains. It soon expanded southward, the only direction possible. In the second half of the century, a theater, 161, and a large imperial bathhouse, 183, were built outside the original city walls. A few years later, the open area beyond the old walls was formally redesigned as a new and larger forum, featuring a triumphal arch, 216, dedicated to Caracalla, and an impressive temple to the Severan dynasty, 229. Quiquel's buildings followed familiar Roman patterns. The Old Town included a colonnaded main street, a forum complex, a market building, a large public bath taking up almost an entire block, many private houses, and, unlike Timgad, 2 temples. The forum square was flanked by colonnades on 2 sides, with a plain rectangular basilica with a raised tribunal at one end, a large capitolium with a triple cell design, and a curia with an inner courtyard. The Cocinius market was a typical macellum, with an open plaza lined with shops and porticos around a central hexagonal pavilion. Just like in Lepsis, the city's official weights and measures were publicly displayed here. One temple, dedicated to Venus Genetrix, had a unique design with only its porch and steps projecting from the back wall of a columned courtyard. By the later period, many elegant houses with peristyle courtyards were built on the sites of earlier, simpler homes. In these houses, the main room, triclinium, often faced the courtyard and adapted to the site's constraints. These peristyle houses were typical of upper-class homes in North African cities, though they varied greatly depending on local conditions and the owner's wealth. For example, exceptional houses in Bulla Regia had 2 full living levels, used in summer and winter. The House of the Muses in Altheburos, Tunisia, dating from the 2nd century, had a more open layout and sat freely within a garden. The House of Venus and the Palace in Volubilis, Morocco, built in the mid-3rd century, was part of a planned residential zone. A house in Tipasa was terraced onto a sloping, sea-facing plot, with shops on the ground floor behind a colonnaded arcade facing the street. Although specific layouts varied, the basic form of these houses remained surprisingly consistent. These houses shared one major feature with bathhouses and other public buildings: the extensive and colorful use of mosaics. These polychrome decorations, found on floors, walls, and vaults, helped define one of the most recognizable characteristics of late antique architecture, with North Africa leading the way in this development. Although the theater at Quiquel was built on an impressive terraced slope along the eastern hills, its size and capacity were similar to the one in Timgad, and its design was quite basic. In contrast, the bathhouse built in 183 AD was far more original. This uniqueness came from how the typical imperial bath plan was cleverly adapted to a narrow site. The layout used diamond-shaped lines of sight leading from the entrance to the caldarium. It also included sophisticated concave forms, which were advanced for the time and place. These features suggest that a specially trained architect designed the building. The new forum was dominated by 2 buildings: the Arch of Caracalla, which nearly got moved to Paris in 1842, and the Temple of the Severan dynasty. The temple had a nearly square cella and a front with 4 columns. It stood against the back wall of a square courtyard that had columned galleries along both sides. Its design was similar to other temples in North Africa, but it stood on a very high podium, reached by a monumental 3-level staircase. This gave it a strong sense of authority and elegance, even if the structure itself wasn't especially complex. Another important point in Quiquel's architectural history is the surprising wave of building activity across North African cities during the 3rd quarter of the 4th century. Many public buildings, including pagan temples, were repaired, and new ones like a grain storehouse in Roussicade, modern Philippeville, were built. Quiquel also saw new Christian buildings on its southern hill, and a large civil basilica between 364 and 367 AD. This hall had a rectangular plan with a single apse, resembling reception halls of that time. A similar building was added near the Arch of Caracalla, possibly a textile market. Inscriptions also mention a portico named after Emperor Gratian, died 383 AD. All this happened during a time when urban life was collapsing in many parts of the empire, showing that Roman civilization in Africa was still alive and active. The previous pages gave detailed information about 4 cities in North Africa: Lepsis Magna, Sabratha, Timgad, and Kwaikul. Lepsis and Sabratha were examples of Roman city life built on older settlements founded by the Carthaginians. These cities show how architecture developed in continuity in Roman North Africa. They also had Mediterranean port connections, showing how outside influences shaped their architecture. On the other hand, Timgad and Kwaikul were newly founded cities. Through them, we see how Roman urban design was introduced into areas with no prior infrastructure. At first, their architecture was naturally imitative because they were far from creative centers and received new ideas late. Still, once Roman culture was planted, it grew deeply. The Christian architecture in these towns, though not discussed here, was just as much a part of this legacy as the monuments of the Antonine and Severan periods. This success reflects the foresight and practical planning of their Roman founders. This architectural record could go on endlessly. Many large coastal cities, like Carthage, Utica, Hippo Regius, modern Annaba, Tipasa, and Caesarea, Churchill, also hold surviving monuments from this legacy. Sabratha, though smaller, belonged to the same cultural heritage as Lepsis. These coastal cities were the source for many well-preserved inland settlements. Most of these interior cities grew from pre-Roman communities, as seen in their winding streets and irregular plans. Many of them still have significant Roman architectural remains. Some of the best-known examples are Gigthus, Maktar, Madoros, birthplace of writer Apuleius, Sufetula, modern Spaitla, Theveste, Tebesa, Tibilis, Anuna, Thuburbo-Maius, Thuga, Duga, and Volubilis. There were also smaller rural towns that looked like big cities, even if they were never officially recognized. One of the best-studied examples is Castellum Tititanorum, near Cirta. Each of these places has important structures, but getting lost in the details can hide the bigger picture. That's why the rest of this section will focus on broader topics like the pre-Roman legacy, how outside influences evolved, and the wider cultural context of architecture in Roman North Africa. We have briefly mentioned earlier the local traditions behind the oldest surviving architecture in Lepsis Magna and Sabratha. As we move west into regions once under direct Carthaginian influence, these traditions become even clearer. For a long time, building materials and construction methods used in everyday architecture, like widespread use of plaster decoration, were based on pre-Roman practices. Architectural details were less affected. As Roman influence grew, local features without classical roots began to disappear. Phoenician-style volute capitals and Egyptian cornices are good examples. These styles had already spread from Phoenicia through Sicily, Sardinia, and North Africa as early as the 5th century BC, and can still be found in 1st century Syria. They appear on a 2nd century tower-like tomb at Thuga and the large round Medracan tomb near Lambesis, probably the tomb of King Micipsa, who died in 118 BC, where Doric style is used. But these forms rarely survived into the 1st century AD in Africa. However, Ionic capitals continued in Lepsis throughout the 1st century. In Tunisia, where Italian influence was stronger, early 1st century Tuscan-style capitals became common. Even in Trajan's time, these capitals were seen in forums like Tubursicu Numidarum, modern Camisa, and on the street colonnades in Timgad. As in the rest of the Roman world, the strongest and most lasting local influence in Africa was in religious architecture, temples and tombs. Among the many Roman-era temples, 2 main types stand out. The first is the typical Republican Italic temple, usually with front columns or in pseudo-peripteral style, built on a podium with stairs. These temples are found all over Africa in a nearly uniform layout. Some stood alone. Others were placed against the back wall of a rectangular, often colonnaded sacred courtyard, as at Tuburbo. They varied greatly in size and decoration, from simple box-like forms at Thebales, to larger temples with 3-columned sides at Gigthus, to monumental types like the Capitolium at Timgad or the 4-sided Calestis temple at Thugga. While the names of the gods, like Mercury, Saturn, Apollo, or Caelestis, were often Latinized versions of local deities, the worship practices followed classical Roman forms. The Italic origins of this temple type are clearly seen by their absence in Cyrenaica. The second group of temples opened directly into sacred courtyards, sometimes with 1 or 2 steps. Examples include the Temple of Ceres at Thuburbo Maius, the temple in Sufetula, later converted into the Church of Service, and the Temple of Saturn at Thugga. Others include a Roman Phoenician temple at Nora in Sardinia, and a recently found example at Lixus in Morocco. In at least one case, at Thugga, a Roman temple was built above an older Phoenician Tophet, sacrificial site. This shows that such temples were Roman-era versions of a sacred structure already familiar in Phoenician Africa. These buildings continued the idea of a Holy of Holies, where sacred objects were stored while rituals took place in open-air courtyards. Over time, the differences between Phoenician and Roman temple types gradually disappeared, just like in Gaul. One clear step in this transformation was the use of open exedra-style colonnades, like those at Sufetula and Thugga, in place of earlier closed cella entrances. Similar designs can also be seen in the Ceres and Mercury temples at Thuburbo Maius, and probably in the Northwest Forum Temple at Sabratha. The next stage involved placing the cella on a podium, while allowing it to extend beyond the rear wall of the sacred enclosure. Examples of this can be found at the Venus Genetrix Temple in Quiquel, the 2nd century Minerva Temple at Thugga, and a temple built in 162 AD at Lambesis. In the final stage, the cella became fully integrated into the sacred enclosure. At that point, it was no longer distinguishable from a classic Roman temple. This explains why this type of temple became so common in the region. The temple at Lambesis is a rare example in Africa with a Baroque-style plan. Its porch was squeezed between curved projections of the portico. It shows similarities with the Nymphaeum sanctuary near Zaghuan, which supplied water to Carthage. Outside of religious buildings, almost all architectural ideas used in Roman Africa came from Italy. Even before the Roman conquest, there were strong influences from Magna Graecia and Sicily. After Rome took over in 146 BC, the impact of Rome and Campania became more direct. Our current knowledge makes it hard to fully understand Republican period influences, but some building types that became common later, like podium temples and macella, marketplaces, likely came from this era. More broadly, the acceptance of classical forms and ideas as natural tools for architecture led to the rapid development seen after Augustus' peace. Throughout the 1st century, building materials and techniques still showed traces of earlier traditions. But places like Lepsis reveal signs of originality in the details, suggesting the birth of a distinct local Roman African architecture. Still, the main types of buildings, basilicas, state temples, theaters, and aqueducts, remained Italian in origin. As military colonies were established and new towns built, this connection grew stronger. Cities like Timgad can be seen as small Italian towns transplanted to the frontier. By the early 2nd century, the outlook began to expand. Italy and the western provinces remained important influences. A deeper look would reveal many links to Mediterranean Spain. New concrete architecture started to challenge the traditional architectural mindset in the provinces. At the same time, there was a major shift toward using marble as the main material for monumental buildings. High-quality marble and granite came from the Aegean and Egypt, bringing with them new craftsmanship and decorative styles. Within a generation, local materials and styles disappeared from major buildings in coastal cities, replaced by a showy but often standard marble style. This new architecture followed imperial standards, not local ones. The Antonine Baths in Carthage and the Severan buildings in Lepsis Magna best show the mix of Italian and Eastern Mediterranean influences. Though Roman Africa was never a creative center itself, it always remained open to adopting outside ideas and applying them with skill. The surviving monuments show just how much the Roman Empire could express through architecture. When Emperor Severus Alexander was killed in 235 AD, the empire entered a chaotic period full of civil wars and foreign threats. Emperors, overwhelmed by constant uprisings and border attacks, could no longer focus on grand building projects. Their treasuries were strained by the demands of the army. During the short reign of Aurelian, 270 to 275, some stability returned. His city walls were urgently needed, but his Temple of the Sun on the Campus Martius was a monument in the best imperial tradition. Aurelian was assassinated in 275, and within 10 years, a fire destroyed many monuments at the north end of the Roman Forum. Imperial authority was restored by Diocletian in 284, leading to the last great building period in Rome, which would last until Constantine moved the capital to Constantinople in 330. Aurelian's city walls remained Rome's defense system, with only minor changes until 1870. They were started in 270 or 271 AD, when German tribes reached the Po Valley and showed Rome could no longer neglect its own security. This was a massive project, over 19 kilometers long, and even with the construction sector fully mobilized, it took 10 years. The walls were 3.5 to 4 meters thick and 7.8 meters high, with a continuous walkway and square towers every 29.6 meters. There were 18 main gates, supported by towers with archways, windows, and defensive features. Most of the structure was made of concrete and covered with old bricks. It seems the state's brick production system had collapsed since the Severan period. Later emperors, especially Maxentius, and then Arcadius and Honorius, around 403, raised the height of the walls and reinforced the gates. These walls symbolized Rome's changing role within the empire. In the past, military architecture at the borders had little effect on the Mediterranean provinces. But now, for the first time, border defenses came to the capital itself. Rome had become just one of many cities in Europe defending itself against northern threats. The direction of influence had reversed, and decline was happening everywhere. The impact of Aurelian's walls on contemporary thought and design must have been strong. Their simple, practical lines predicted the look of late Roman architecture. Aurelian's other great project, the Temple of the Sun, also reflected the mood of the age. It showed the growing interest in monotheistic, Eastern-style religion, something that would later influence Christianity. This temple is often connected to other artworks of the time, like the Christ Helios mosaic in the Vatican Cemetery and Constantine's Sol Invictus coins. The resources for its construction came from Aurelian's 273rd reconquest of Palmyra. Today, none of the classical structures remain. They once stood east of the modern Corso, under and around the Church of St. Silvestro. Our knowledge comes mostly from Palladio's 16th century drawings, when some of the buildings were still standing. Palladio's plan shows a circular temple in a large rectangular courtyard. The only entrance was on the short north side, leading to an antechamber in one of the two apses. The 90-degree shift between the forecourt and the sanctuary only makes sense in the wider architectural context. Although Palladio didn't draw porticos, the courtyard was likely surrounded by columns, similar to Syrian temples like the Temple of Bel in Palmyra. The side exedrae probably came from the Temple of Peace, built by Vespasian. The round temple, with 8 porphyry columns over 6.88 meters tall, was a symbolic structure. These columns were later used by Justinian in the Hagia Sophia. This circular plan was just as meaningful as the cruciform churches that would follow a century later. The broken pediments and twin columns in the forecourt decoration were clearly borrowed from Trajan's Forum, and other details resembled the decoration in Caracalla's baths, which Aurelian had repaired after the fire. Despite its unusual features, Palladio's plan is believable. It reflects the same wide-ranging, eclectic design approach we later see in Constantine's imperial buildings. By contrast, Diocletian's 284–305 works showed a more conservative taste. The rebuilt Senate House, Curia, after the fire in 283, kept the traditional layout of earlier versions from Domitian and Julius's time. It was a simple rectangular hall, with low steps for seating on each side and a raised speaker's platform. The ceiling height was set according to Vitruvius's rule, half the sum of the hall's length and width. The walls were simple above, with windows near the ceiling, while the lower walls and floor were decorated with columns and multicolored marble. From the outside, it looks plain today, but in ancient times, surrounded by the Basilica Aemilia and Secretarium Senatus, only the decorated gable was visible. The gable had 3 large windows and was once coated in plaster made to look like stone. Traces still remain today. The cornice featured angled brackets near the corners, an early architectural use of a trick seen more often in painting. Diocletian also began a large bath complex around 298 on the northeast slope of the Viminal Hill, completed by 305 to 306. Its design closely followed the layout of the Baths of Caracalla, but with more balanced side buildings and a more compact central block. The rotunda at the corner still survives today as the Church of St. Bernardo. One key feature was the visual axis along the main length of the building, creating alternating patterns of light and shadow. The service courtyards were laid out logically, and the short axis alternated between rectangular and curved spaces. Most notably, the traditional domed caldarium was replaced by a rectangular cross-vaulted room with 4 apses. While the Baths of Caracalla marked the peak of this building type, Diocletian's baths represented its full refinement. From the outside, this bath complex made its impact mainly through the arrangement of its massive stone forms, but the interior was rich and varied. On one end, there were 3-story columned exedras along the cold pool, frigidarium wall, while on the other end, the large triple-vaulted frigidarium hall, later turned into the Church of S. Maria degli Angeli by Vanvitelli using Michelangelo's plans, showed a calm and grand design. Like the Pantheon, this was a structure meant to be experienced, not just described. Today, the original views are blocked, and marble and mosaic. One of Rome's last pagan emperors, Maxentius, 306 to 312, was a very active builder. Although his restoration of the Senate offices, Secretarium Senatus, no longer exists, it complemented Diocletian's earlier work on the Curia. On the Velia Hill, at the opposite end of the Forum, parts of Hadrian's Temple of Venus and Roma that survive today mostly belong to Maxentius' reconstruction after a fire in 307. That same fire also gave way to Maxentius' most ambitious project, the Basilica Nova, which was completed by Constantine. Though only partly standing, it still dominates its surroundings. Near the Via Appia, Maxentius also built a suburban palace complex with a hippodrome and a large family mausoleum. He is also remembered for the first major improvements made to the Aurelian walls. In the Temple of Venus and Roma, the outer walls and colonnades survived the fire. Maxentius focused mainly on redesigning the two cellas, inner rooms. These were built entirely in brick-faced concrete and covered in high-quality marble. The new walls were placed inside the older ones made of tufa stone from Hadrian's time, which were later removed for reuse. One key change was replacing a flat central wall with two back-to-back apses, a design earlier credited to Hadrian, but actually by Maxentius. Decorative columned ediculae were added in corners and apses, much like those seen in Diocletian's Curia and Baths. The half-domes of the apses featured lozenge-shaped coffering. Even more complex coffering in plaster decorated the main vaults of the Basilica Nova. Excavations at the Via Appia complex revealed an apsidal reception hall with a long entrance corridor, similar to the one at Piazza Armerina. In late antiquity, imperial palaces often included hippodromes. The one here held about 15,000 spectators and gives insight into the social and political role of chariot racing. Key features included slightly irregular layouts for fair starts, traditional starting gates with towers, offset turning points on the central barrier, an imperial viewing box at the finish line, and a second officials box on the opposite side. Racers had separate entrances and exits. In the center stood an Egyptian obelisk copied from the one at Circus Maximus. Maxentius brought it from Domitian's Temple of Isis. In 1651, it was reused by Pope Innocent X in Bernini's fountain at Piazza Navona. Architecturally, the hippodrome was built using alternating bands of brick and small tufa blocks, and light vaults supported by hollow pottery vessels, typical of the late Roman style. The mausoleum was a circular domed structure raised on a high platform, with a broad columned entrance and a central courtyard open on four arched sides. It resembled the one on the Via Praenestina at Tor de' Schiavi, both being reinterpretations of the Pantheon. However, unlike the Pantheon, which had a narrow front and was meant to be seen from only one side, these mausoleums were freestanding and visible from all directions. They were set on high platforms containing the burial chambers. The entrance and domed room shared the same cornice lines. The inner height was exaggerated compared to the width, and the drum's interior had a single decorative scheme. Like many Pantheon imitations, they aimed to solve architectural challenges of the original, but didn't always succeed. Still, these efforts reflect the spirit of the time. One innovation was the four round windows placed high in the drum at Tor de' Schiavi, replacing the traditional central oculus. There may also have been a vaulted monumental entrance, as suggested by an 8th century drawing. No other pagan Roman monument matches this scale, but it shouldn't be ruled out. The arcaded galleries around Maxentius's courtyard, with half columns and decorated cornices hiding the load-bearing structures, consciously imitated early Roman Republican and imperial styles. The most striking monument of Maxentius's reign was the basilica on the eastern slope of the Velia, next to the Via Sacra. Though left incomplete, Constantine finished it, and it became one of the greatest architectural feats of classical antiquity. In form, it resembled the main hall of a large imperial bath, an entrance porch on the east and a shallow apse for a giant imperial statue on the west. Constantine later modified this axis by adding a porch at the center of the southern side and an apse on the opposite exedra wall. The central nave was 80 by 25 meters, and the 3 cross-vaulted sections rose 35 meters from floor to ceiling. 8 fluted columns of Proconesian marble supported these vaults and framed the 3 massive barrel-vaulted exedras on both long sides. These, still standing on the north side, supported the structure while enhancing the sense of spatial unity, despite the heavy piers. This unity came from the balance between the long central axis and the 3 intersecting cross-axes. Another building, traditionally, but debatably, attributed to Maxentius, is the so-called Temple of Romulus, located just west of the Basilica Nova. It was later converted into the entrance for the Saints Cosmas and Damian Church. The building was a domed rotunda. Its entrance was not set into a projecting porch, but flanked by 2 narrow wings. These wings had pairs of columns in front, forming the main Via Sacra-facing facade. The rotunda had 4 large windows on diagonal axes, and 2 doors opened to side rooms. The courtyard was originally rectangular, but was soon reshaped into a semicircle, though the stonework remained consistent. This area featured a facade decorated with columned niches, which are still visible among later medieval additions. The projecting wings' entablatures rested on brackets atop the columns, but what sat above those is unknown. A unique feature was that both the entrance columns and those around the large bronze doors stood on podium-like bases. Though common in the eastern provinces for 2 centuries, this style was almost never seen in Rome before. Whether this was truly a temple for Maxentius's son, Romulus, who died in 309, is unclear. Coins and medieval stories offer no proof. Still, the building stands next to the area Maxentius rebuilt after the 307 fire. Its masonry resembles the Basilica Nova's, and an old sketch by Panvino suggests a Constantinian inscription, even though the building was remodeled soon after, possibly due to Constantine's known interest in facades along the Via Sacra. Even if Maxentius didn't build it, it certainly dates from that era. The contrasting shapes of the rotunda and the concave forecourt, framed by the flanking wings, were carefully designed. This structure stands as one of the last brilliant expressions of pagan Roman architecture, hinting at how much creative potential still remained. Even though Maxentius was defeated and killed by Constantine in 312, imperial generosity in Rome didn't immediately stop. That came later, when Constantine, tired of hostility from the pagan aristocracy, founded a new capital on the Bosporus and officially dedicated it in 330. In his early years as emperor, Constantine remained active, much like his predecessor. Some of his construction efforts were directly tied to the needs of the newly recognized Christian religion, like the building of Rome's new cathedral. However, other projects still belonged to the old, fading world. Alongside completing Maxentius's unfinished buildings, Constantine also added several important monuments that reflect the last phase of pagan architecture in Rome, including the Arch of Constantine, his baths, and 2 large imperial mausolea, Tor Pignatara and the one at S. Costanza. The Arch of Constantine was built to commemorate his victory over Maxentius and completed in 315. Its design closely follows that of the Arch of Septimius Severus at the western end of the Forum, but it is more elegant in proportion and has a better arrangement of statues, with a triple attic that matches the arch openings. Some of the relief panels are original, while others, like the statues of captive barbarians, were reused from older monuments. These reused pieces provide a unique selection of imperial art from Trajan to Constantine. The panels from Constantine's time are often judged for their artistic quality, either praised or criticized, but they clearly show a major artistic trend of the early 4th century. Although they might have upset traditional viewers, they represent a strong artistic shift of the era. A more controversial topic is the poorer quality of the sculpted panels copied from older examples, especially those on the column bases or spandrels. This weakness was not due to an overall artistic decline, but because large-scale relief carving had mostly disappeared from Rome about 80 years earlier. The new narrative panels were likely carved by sarcophagus sculptors still working in Rome at the time. Since decorative sculpture had nearly vanished from large buildings, replaced by painted plaster, colored marble, and mosaics, there was little experience left with large stone reliefs. So it's no surprise that the sculptors of Constantine's arch struggled. Their limitations reflect a shift in taste rather than artistic failure. Overall, the arch seems to recall an earlier era, perhaps deliberately. Another building from early in Constantine's reign was a bath complex on the Quirinal Hill, near the Temple of Serapis. Although most of it was lost by the 17th century, drawings by Palladio and Duperac show that it followed the layout of large imperial baths. The complex included a swimming pool, a 3-part frigidarium, a 4-apse tepidarium with side courtyards, and a large circular caldarium, all arranged symmetrically around a central axis. While the familiar curves might have been a reaction to the rigid layout of Diocletian's baths, this structure introduced some new features. These include a circular caldarium with 3 apses and many windows, similar to the Minerva Medica Exedras, and a central focus on the frigidarium's main hall. This shows a deliberate trend toward centralized design, also seen in the Basilica Nova. One of Constantine's imperial mausolea, Tor Pignatara, located along the Via Praenestina, was originally intended for him, but ended up housing only his mother, Helena. It followed the circular mausoleum style seen in Maxentius' tomb and Tor de Schiavi. Unlike those, it had no large porch. Instead, the entrance was through the end of the nave of the attached church of Saints Peter and Marcellinus. The building continued the vertical emphasis of earlier tombs by raising the drum and adding 8 large arched windows. These openings were matched on the exterior by fluted niches. Though the dome has collapsed, traces show it was once decorated with mosaic and built with large hollow jars to reduce weight. The walls below the dome were clad in colored marble. The drum's grooved exterior is one of the building's most interesting features. Similar patterns appeared earlier in the Baths of Caracalla and the Venus Temple at Baiae. The same kind of curving and counter-curving form was used in the Temple of Romulus in the Forum. This design was also copied in a well-preserved rotunda near Tivoli called the Temple of the Cough, Tempio della Tosa, likely built around the same time. Helena's tomb was still essentially pagan in style. However, the mausoleum of Constantine's daughter Constantina, now the Church of Saint Costanza, went beyond that. It introduced a new Christian form, a rotunda surrounded by a vaulted, arched walkway. This design, inspired by the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, became a model for later central-plan churches. Still, the building retained some pagan elements. Its mosaics, including those in the walkway and the Lost Dome, don't reflect Christian themes. They were likely made by artists whose fathers and grandfathers had worked on the Baths of Diocletian and Caracalla. These works offer a rare glimpse into the classical artistic traditions that were disappearing. The most complex late Roman rotunda near Rome is the so-called Temple of Minerva Medica in the gardens of Licinianus. Though the gardens belonged to Emperor Gallienus, brick stamps show the building was constructed in the early 4th century and later strengthened to prevent collapse. Technically, it isn't round, but decagonal, with a 25-meter diameter. The walls have 9 large apses. The 10th side is the entrance, and some apses open to triple-arched porticos. The drum is also decagonal and lit by 10 arched windows. The transition to the dome is achieved by softening the angles to form a circular base. The dome itself was built using a unique method, a brick skeleton filled in with lightweight materials. The bricks were placed in vertical strips and tied together with horizontal bands, all rising with the surrounding concrete. Each ring of the dome was topped with tiles to form self-contained sections, which made construction easier and prevented widespread collapse. This technique allowed the dome's weight to be spread out and helped localize any cracking. This ribbed brick construction can also be seen in many late Roman buildings like the Villa of the Gordians, Diocletian's Baths, and the Basilica Nova. Though it resembles Gothic ribbed vaults, the function was very different. These ribs didn't carry structural loads. In fact, many don't even reach the top of the vault or are interrupted by other construction. They were built alongside the light tufa concrete and mostly served as scaffolding or construction guides. Still, they probably did add some stability, and ancient builders likely noticed this. Drawings made before 1828 show that parts of the Minerva Medica dome's ribs stood even after the concrete had fallen away. St. Costanza's dome also had 8 full ribs. This suggests Roman architects were starting to understand how to direct forces along certain lines, though their approach was experimental and based on observation. Until the early 4th century, the strength of Roman vaults mainly depended on the quality of the mortar and the foundations. By that time, in central Italy's volcanic areas, the quality of mortar was already very reliable. The main problem had become structural collapse. If any part of the solid concrete vault started to break apart, it could cause much stronger outward forces than expected in the original design. Careful architects tried to predict this, and since the time of the Flavian Palace and the Pantheon, Roman concrete vault architecture often included added supports to fix real or possible weaknesses. The Licinian Pavilion, too, was changed not long after construction for this reason. Still, no matter the technical innovations, the vaults built in Maxentius and Constantine's time kept the main features of early imperial Roman concrete architecture. When we look at the final stage of pagan Roman architecture as a whole, 2 things stand out. Brick-faced concrete had clearly become the standard material, and it was used with great skill. Except for a few triumphal arches built in traditional style, finely cut stone walls almost disappeared after the mid-2nd century. In appearance, later brickwork, with reused materials and alternating brick and tuff layers, may look less elegant than earlier work. Diocletian's reforms in brick production briefly improved quality, but after Constantine moved the capital to Constantinople, building activity in Rome slowed down again. Still, just seeing massive structures like the Basilica Nova is enough to show that this was only a surface-level decline. Builders of the time knew their materials very well. Even if they accepted slightly rougher workmanship, this trade-off allowed huge complexes like the Aurelian Walls or the Baths of Diocletian to be completed in just a decade, a small price for the technical and organizational improvements achieved. There is not much new to add about the building techniques of the time, as many of them were already known, but had not yet been used on a large scale. For instance, alternating layers of brick and tuff had been seen often in Hadrian's villa and the Villa of Setebasi during the 2nd century. But only in this period did this method start to appear in monumental buildings and become widespread. Brick ribs had been used in the barrel vaults of the Colosseum and in some later structures like Severan foundations on the Palatine Hill. Lightweight materials such as tuff or pumice were already used in the Pantheon's dome. All these techniques were now applied systematically. One of the most important innovations was placing large pottery jars at the start points of vaults to reduce the weight of concrete in thick areas. This method was used in places like the Villa of Gordianus, the Baths of Diocletian, and the Circus of Maxentius, and became important in early Christian architecture in central and northern Italy. Other techniques, like using interlocking pipe-shaped tiles or pure brick structures, were already used in other regions, North Africa for the former and the eastern provinces for the latter. These styles finally reached pagan Rome, with examples seen in places like Split, near Diocletian's palace. In terms of design, this was a transitional era in many ways. Looking back, people often see it as the time just before Christianity triumphed and early Christian architecture took shape. But this view ignores the architectural changes already happening in Rome and across the empire before Constantine. The shift from classical to late antique architecture was not only caused by Christianity's rise, but also by the deep crisis of the 3rd century. In Rome, any architectural development naturally moved toward fuller use of concrete's structural and artistic potential. The early experimental phase had ended. After the mid-2nd century, construction became more organized and standardized. But now, as new forms became common, architects entered a new, slightly restless and experimental phase. This period explored new spatial possibilities, like domed rotundas and the large groin-vaulted halls of imperial baths. These new forms started to replace classical patterns. At the same time, architects became more aware of the monumental potential of brick-faced concrete without following traditional orders. However, this progress did not follow a single clear path. Instead, many overlapping or even conflicting styles emerged. When these trends were used to meet the needs of the new religion, they gained shared forms and goals. In that way, first, we should not ignore the fact that some of these buildings were very large. The line between grandeur and excessive display is thin, and for modern observers, it's hard to understand the real impact of late Roman architecture without visiting the buildings themselves, something we often can't do today. Still, it's safe to say that the Basilica Nova was not just big, but genuinely impressive. Of course, using large scale effectively was not new to Rome. Structures like the Colosseum, the Pont du Gard aqueduct, or the Temple of Jupiter in Baalbek all showed Rome's traditional skill in mastering engineering materials. Another trait shared with earlier Roman architecture was the constant search for height. In earlier temples, this was done by raising buildings on tall bases. In late Roman interiors, height was achieved in new ways. If we use the Pantheon's inner proportions as a guide, we can see how late Roman design increasingly emphasized vertical elements. This depended on the ability to add windows at the top of the dome's drum without weakening the dome. This was already done in places like the Temple of Venus at Baiae and the Baths of Caracalla. By the end of the 4th century, the traditional central oculus had fallen out of use. Diocletian's Curia shows this trend clearly. It used high windows near the ceiling to contrast with the flat lines of the lower walls, creating a dramatic effect. Domed, centrally planned buildings continued to play an important role in architectural thinking, just as they had earlier. The arrangement of bath halls into sequential spaces had already shown how interiors could be enhanced by connecting them to the outside. In the Pantheon, the exedras built into the thick outer walls gave the impression of openness. Still, despite this and similar experiments at Hadrian's villa, the central rotunda remained a mostly closed and inward-facing form. Replacing the central oculus with windows in the drum was one step toward a more open design. A real break with tradition, however, only came in the early 4th century with the Licinian pavilion. Its complex lobed plan and arched columned exedras combined elements from Hadrian's time in a new, dynamic way. Through the arches, people inside the building could now see directly outside. Around the same time, the architect of S. Costanza developed the idea of a central domed space surrounded by a continuous arched walkway. By the mid-4th century, the Church of St. Lorenzo in Milan united both ideas in a single structure. This became one of the most influential models for early Christian architecture, later shaping buildings like S. Vitale in Ravenna, the Church of SS, Sergius and Bacchus in Constantinople, and even Hagia Sophia. Until the end of the pagan period, the focus of design remained firmly on the interior. It's too much to say that facades were ignored, but very few buildings seem to have been designed with their exterior as the main concern. Classical styles were still used occasionally, especially in more conservative contexts. But when we look at individual buildings, it's clear that this classical style was no longer a living tradition. It had become something inherited or deliberately revived from the past. The use of temple porticos like those of the Pantheon, or Trajan's Forum in imperial mausoleums, or the revival of long-abandoned Flavian plans in Maxentius's mausoleum, or the theatrical design of Diocletian's Baths swimming pool wall, all show that architects viewed classical elements more like collectors of antique styles. We will see the same approach in the provinces during this period. It is easier to show with evidence that the values of classical exterior architecture were abandoned than to define a new exterior style that replaced them. The acceptance of the functional logic of new building materials did not automatically lead to satisfying visual results. We can see this clearly in the cold, military-like look of 3 out of 4 facades of the central block of the Baths of Caracalla. However, on the south side of the building, the large row of windows was skillfully used to frame and highlight the central rotunda. These large windows, which became more common during this time thanks to the wider use of glass sheets set in lead frames, give us the clearest idea of how a new external aesthetic began to develop in the late pre-Christian era. Grouped or evenly spaced, these windows brought life and rhythm to otherwise plain walls, as seen in the curved window recesses at Tor de Schiavi, showing a deeper awareness of aesthetic possibilities. The same can be clearly seen in buildings like the Basilica in Trier. At the Basilica Nova, windows were mainly for lighting the interior. But in Trier's Basilica, they were arranged to create a striking. Comparing this building to the early 5th century church of Santa Sabina makes it clear that Christian architecture directly continued from where pagan architecture left off. The military crisis of the 3rd century was a disaster that shook the whole empire to its core. While a few privileged areas like Asia Minor and North Africa seemed to escape complete ruin, even there public building activity almost stopped due to economic troubles, especially when compared to the 2nd century. Regions like Gaul, northern Italy, the Danube provinces, Greece, and Syria were invaded and looted by enemy forces. Though Roman authority was eventually restored, for example, the Syrian metropolis enjoyed 3 more centuries of prosperity under the classical model. The citizens of the empire no longer felt secure about the future. The world that emerged from this crisis was very different from the one before. This change was especially clear in the relationship between Rome and the provinces. Italy had already lost its dominance over the provinces, but in the 2nd century, Rome was still unquestionably the empire's center. By now, it was obvious that such a large world could not be ruled by one man from one city. Diocletian's solution was the tetrarchy system, with 2 senior and 2 junior emperors. Despite some internal tensions, this system allowed for a successful reorganization of the empire's military, government, and economy. At the start of the 4th century, Constantine's strong leadership briefly restored central authority. But before long, and without any dramatic event, the empire was once again permanently split into eastern and western halves. This division would shape the history of the northern Mediterranean for the next 7 or 8 centuries. The most important event in this whole process was the founding of Constantinople in 330 as the new capital of the Roman world. While this was a powerful and symbolic act, the idea of founding new capitals was not entirely new. In the previous 40 years, the emperors of the Tetrarchy had officially or unofficially established about half a dozen new capitals across the empire: Antioch, Nicomedia, Thessaloniki, Sirmium, Milan, and Trier. These cities were mostly built using local labor, materials, and resources. Each represented the peak of architecture in its region. Yet, at the same time, they had a character that went beyond local boundaries. Differences in climate, craftsmanship, methods, and materials aside, the architectural needs of an imperial palace or a public bathhouse were more or less the same, whether on the Danube, in Syria, or in Gaul. This trend had already appeared a century earlier in Lepsis. Regional differences were fading, and at no other time in Mediterranean history had such a shared architectural language come so close to being realized. Of the Tetrarchic capitals, Nicomedia, in Bithynia, and Sirmium, near modern Belgrade, have left almost no remains. Sadly, very little is known about Antioch and Milan either. But we do have good information about Trier and Thessaloniki. In addition, 2 very rich residential sites from the same period offer valuable insight. Diocletian's retirement palace in Split, Spalato, built in 305, and the large villa at Piazza Armerina in Sicily. Trier, known in Roman times as Augusta Treverorum, sat in a strategic position on the Moselle River behind the Rhine army. In 293, when Diocletian made Constantius Chlorus one of the junior emperors, Trier was chosen as the main base for his military and administrative control over a vast area, from the Strait of Gibraltar to Hadrian's Wall and from the Rhine to the Atlantic Ocean. The city was later ruled by Constantius himself, his son Constantine, his grandson Constantine II, and from 364 to 375 by Valentinian, and from 375 to 383 by Gratian. In 395, the imperial court officially moved to Milan and the military headquarters to Arles. During its peak, Trier was home to some of the era's most important writers and Christian thinkers: Ausonius, Lactantius, Athanasius, Saint Jerome, Saint Ambrose, Saint Martin of Tours, and Saint Augustine. For nearly a century, it was the political and cultural heart of the West. The Porta Nigra, or Black Gate, was built to impress travelers with the power of imperial Rome. Its unusual features show a deliberate return to early imperial models. The design was inspired by first-century gates like the Porta Palatina in Turin or the Porte Saint-André in Autun, Gaul. The only real adjustment to modern military needs was building stronger, deeper towers. The decoration also followed early Roman patterns, using arches and architectural frames that originally appeared over wagon roads. But in this case, the design was applied across the whole structure in an overly grand style, even though it was not always appropriate. 2 rows of arches with 144 total spanned the entire building, with a 3rd row around the towers. The rough finish of the stone is often compared to the deliberately rugged style of Rome's Porta Maggiore, but in this case, it was unintentional. The gate was never completed. There is no certain date for its construction, but it was likely built either during the city's rebuilding after a disaster in 275 to 276, or during Constantine's early years, which could also explain why it was left unfinished, like his baths. Thessaloniki lay on the Via Egnatia, the main Roman road from Italy to the Bosphorus and Asia, and was already an important city when Galerius chose it as his capital, 293 to 311. At that point, he created a new district on the eastern edge of the city that stretched north and south. The palace stood to the south, next to a hippodrome. To the north was a large rotunda, possibly intended as Galerius's tomb, now known as St. George's Church. Between these two was a grand ceremonial street, marked by a triumphal arch crossing the Via Egnatia. Placing the palace beside the hippodrome followed a tradition started by the Flavian Palace in Rome and seen in later imperial residences in Antioch, Constantinople, Milan, Sirmium, and Trier. Much of the palace remains buried under modern Thessaloniki, but one building still survives. It has a central courtyard, peristyle, surrounded by small rooms on 3 sides. A wide hallway separates the courtyard from the rest. On the east side, between the courtyard and the hippodrome, there was a large rectangular hall with an apse, likely used as a reception room. To the south, across another wide corridor, there was a bath complex and a large octagonal domed hall about 25 meters wide, with corner apses. Although it may seem like a unified complex, this impression is due in part to the limited excavation. Another known part of the palace was a rectangular transverse hall south of the triumphal arch. It marked the beginning of the colonnaded street leading toward the rotunda's ceremonial area. From either direction, the central arch stood out, likely decorated with statues and traditional ornaments. The side arches led to pedestrian paths, which meant that typical arch development could not happen. Instead, reliefs celebrating Galerius's victory over the Persians in 297 were placed directly on the vertical surfaces of the piers. These piers were made of rubble cores covered in marble, and the arches themselves were built of brick. The rotunda's shape and height are like a free-form version of the caldarium, hot room, in the Baths of Caracalla. At the base, there are 8 large barrel-vaulted niches extending outward. Above them are 8 smaller barrel-vaulted niches, lit by large windows. From outside, the dome's base is surrounded by an arched gallery that balances its weight. The entrance porch is small, highlighting the round shape of the building. The interior decorations include marble paneling framed by 2 rows of pilasters and entablatures. The lower niches are flanked by decorative niches similar to those in buildings from Diocletian and Maxentius's time. The mosaics in the niches are original, while those in the dome were added later, when the building was turned into a church in the late 4th century. Although the plan and details of the rotunda clearly follow Roman models, the construction methods are different. Since volcanic sand, used in Roman concrete, was not available, builders used local materials and techniques from Western Anatolia and the northern Aegean. The walls were made of rubble set in mortar, reinforced with brick bands, and faced with either brick or roughly cut stone. Arches and vaults were made of brick. Usually, bricks were placed perpendicular to the curve of the arch, as in classical tradition, but in some vaults of the rotunda and the hippodrome substructure, bricks were laid along the curve, end to end. This bricklaying technique is typical of Byzantine vaulting, but it actually dates back to ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. It required fast-setting mortar, lightweight scaffolding, and allowed flexibility. Though often linked to Byzantine architecture, examples in Thessaloniki and Split show it was already present in the Aegean by the late 3rd century. Another interesting feature of the rotunda is how the lower part of the dome, up to about 7 meters, is shaped as a half-sphere, while the upper part curves differently. The center point of the upper curve is about 2 meters higher. This allowed builders to narrow the lower section inward without scaffolding and to give the upper part a safer angle. The collapse of the first dome at Hagia Sophia shows what happens when such structural precautions are ignored. However, later mosaics added to the rotunda make this curve change almost invisible from ground level. The palace that Diocletian had built for himself on the Dalmatian coast, where he retired in 305, wasn't a palace in the traditional sense. It wasn't part of a bigger city complex. Instead, it was a self-contained country residence, surrounded on all sides by nearly rectangular defensive walls, measuring about 175 to 181 meters by 216 meters. The walls were reinforced with square and octagonal towers. From the gates located at the short northern side and at the center of the long sides, 2 main colonnaded streets ran toward the center of the complex. The main north-south street ended in a smaller colonnaded area called the peristyle, which led directly to the residential section facing the sea. The southern half of the complex included 2 large rectangular areas opposite each other. On the left was the emperor's mausoleum. On the right, a small temple and 2 round buildings with unclear functions. There was no grand gate on the southern, sea-facing side, just a small back passage. Between the corner towers ran a gallery with 3 small gabled pavilions breaking the wall line. The residential section of the palace is mostly known from its still partially uncovered substructures. These lower levels show a series of rectangular halls, sharply separated by corridors, each with a different function. Even in retirement, the emperor still had to carry out formal duties. In the Spalato Palace, the public areas were placed along the central axis. A round entrance hall opened into a large rectangular room, and another doorway at the far end of this room led to the outer gallery. Corridors on either side of the central section connected to 2 other major halls. The hall on the right had an apse at the north end and 2 rows of columns or supports inside. It was likely a reception hall. The hall on the left was probably a dining room, triclinium. At both ends of the main axis were private living quarters and bath complexes. The layout of this building clearly resembles the traditional Roman military camp, castrum. For example, the commander's headquarters, praetorium, was usually placed at the crossing point of the Via Praetoria and the Via Principalis. Military camps had a strong influence on nearby civilian settlements, especially at the frontiers of the empire. In places like Timgad, the forum was laid out in the same way as the nearby Lambasis camp's headquarters. As these military camps evolved into permanent bases, the architectural relationship between military and civilian life became more important, especially in the frontier provinces. The 3rd century crisis added a new layer to this relationship. Many frontier provinces that had developed more slowly culturally began to form their own architectural styles during this time. At the same time, regions stretching from Gaul to the Levant, after centuries of security, now faced direct military threats. The construction of the Aurelian walls in Rome showed how deeply these changes affected architecture. Cities were suddenly surrounded by defensive walls, often built in haste. In the countryside, the situation was more complex. In some areas, like northern Gaul, wealthy villas were simply abandoned. In others, like North Africa, different kinds of defensive villas began to appear, including ones with towers. Small square forts on the Libyan frontier are examples of this variety. Along the Danube, large rural estates were surrounded by semi-military buildings. A 4th century villa near Trier in Pfalzel, built with tall towers and a square plan, may have been used as an imperial country home. Other similar examples include the Qasr ibn Wardan fortress in Syria and early Arab palaces. So, Diocletian's walled villa at Spalato wasn't unique. It was part of a trend in the late 3rd century, when semi-military, fortified villas became more common. Whether Spalato inspired other similar buildings, like the often-mentioned Mogorjello house, or was simply a reflection of broader changes, is unclear and needs further research. This building represented sometimes the city and palace of Philippopolis, modern Shaba, in southern Syria, are compared to Spalato. This was the birthplace of Emperor Philippus, 244 to 249. The construction activities he carried out there act as a bridge between Septimius Severus's projects in Lepsis Magna and the later capitals built by the emperors of the Tetrarchy. However, unlike Spalato, the palace in Philippopolis was part of a larger urban layout. The two intersecting colonnaded streets there reflect similar planning seen in many cities rebuilt in the eastern provinces during that era. A more direct comparison to Spalato might be the palace Diocletian had built in Antioch. This palace was located inside a fortified area first begun under Emperor Valerian, 254 to 259. While most remains are now under the modern Orontes River, the 4th century writer Libanius described the layout. According to him, the palace had a regular plan and was surrounded by a continuous wall like a crown. 4 columned streets extended from a central point marked by 4 arches arranged in a cross shape, a tetrapelon. 3 of the roads met the wall. The 4th was shorter but more beautiful as it led to the palace. The palace covered 1/4 of the entire area and reached all the way to the central tetrapelon. The back wall had a gallery looking toward the river and suburbs, and there was also a hippodrome nearby. While the shape wasn't a perfect rectangle and the palace didn't fill the entire space, the similarities with Spalato's layout are clear. It's very likely this Antioch palace served as one of the models for Diocletian's later residence in Dalmatia. There is no doubt that architects and builders from the eastern provinces worked on Spalato. Many elements in the design clearly came from Syria or Asia Minor. For example, the use of arched lintels and the arched screens flanking the peristyle reflect Syrian influence. The design of the Porta Aurea, Golden Gate, is also typically Syrian. The combination of an open arch and a flat lintel, projecting decorative arches on brackets, and stepped wall surfaces are all found in Syrian architecture, especially in places like the Temple of Bacchus in Baalbek. The carefully cut stonework in the small temple's vaults, brick vaulting, and even the slanted brick technique like that in Thessaloniki all show continued Eastern influence. In the dome of the mausoleum, another version of this technique was used. Bricks were laid in a fan-like pattern, interlocking as they rose upward. To find the inspiration for these design elements, one must look east, to Asia Minor and Syria. But within the same building, there are also features that point west. The mausoleum, with its 8-sided exterior and gabled entrance, along with its circular interior with rectangular and apsed niches, follows Roman imperial tomb traditions. The round vestibule is similar to the Tempio della Tosse in Tivoli. The sea-facing gallery, with its arches framed by half-columns, also reflects a classical revival style, as seen in Maxentius's Mausoleum Courtyard and Trier's Porta Nigra. The apsid reception hall also has Western parallels. It's hard to say for sure where each element came from, but the mix of so many different features in one building clearly shows what defined Tetrarchic architecture: flexibility in geography and the free combination of styles. This palace doesn't belong fully to the east or the west. It carries influences from both. Unlike Spalato, the large villa at Piazza Armerina in south-central Sicily did not need to be defended. Instead of Spalato's compact and orderly plan, this was a spacious and comfortable single-story country house, built in the old Italian villa tradition. 5 main areas can be identified: a triple monumental entrance on the west side with a horseshoe-shaped courtyard, followed by a vestibule, a peristyle garden surrounded by residential rooms, a cross-shaped corridor, and a large apsed reception hall. A private wing, reached from the south end of the corridor, included a semicircular courtyard, 2 bedroom suites, and a small dining room, triclinium. To the south was a separate ceremonial section with a 3-part dining room, triconch, and an oval columned entry court. From the northwest corner of the peristyle, a gently sloped corridor led to the bath section. It is clear that this large villa was not built all at once. Structural additions can be seen in many places, and the vast and detailed mosaic program suggests construction took many years, possibly decades. Yet despite the additions, the overall design remains coherent, suggesting the original plan was mostly followed. This was not the whim of a rich man, but a carefully designed home, suited to a noble landowner's life. 2 traditions especially shaped this villa's design. One is the Italian country villa style, best expressed in Hadrian's Great Villa near Tivoli. Like there, Piazza Armerina's layout brings together partly independent sections and uses different axes in a dynamic and contrasting way. However, unlike older villas that were open to scenic views, this one turns inward, aiming to be self-sufficient and enclosed. The earlier practice of ignoring symmetry becomes a deliberate design rule here. The 45-degree turn from the entrance courtyard to the vestibule, the axis from the vestibule ending at a household shrine, the shift between the peristyle and reception hall, the gradual rise in floor levels from entrance to reception, and the indirect and relaxed connections between the main house and the dining or bathing areas. All these reflect careful and intentional choices. Another important influence seen in the Piazza Armerina villa is the tradition of large Paris-style villas in North Africa. Sicily was so close, both geographically and socially, to Africa that it was almost a part of it. Many wealthy Roman families owned vast estates in places like Tunisia and Algeria. The person who commissioned the mosaics in the villa's large cross corridor was also involved in the profitable trade of exporting exotic African animals to northern amphitheaters. Most of the mosaics, except the one in the large triclinium, were created by mosaic artists brought from North Africa. So it's not surprising that the architecture of the villa also shows similarities with African examples. Although we know little about rural villas in Africa, we can see that some architectural trends were moving in the same direction as the layout at Piazza Armerina. One of these trends, also seen in many other provinces, was the growing importance of the triclinium within the villa plan. It began to take a more central role. Another was the move away from the strict rectangular layouts of traditional peristyle houses toward more flexible forms. These same features, and the presence of a large cross corridor separating the triclinium from the main peristyle area, can also be found in the villa at Portus Magnus near Oran in Algeria, built around the same time. Another element that appears for the first time in elite provincial homes was the triconch 3-lobed reception room. The bath complex too, though originally Italian, became very popular and widespread in North Africa. It's still uncertain whether these elements were directly brought from Africa to Sicily, which itself was always under strong Italian influence, or whether they were personal interpretations of African layouts shaped by dominant Italian traditions. Either way, Piazza Armerina gives us a vivid example of a luxurious patrician villa at the end of pagan antiquity. In the unstable centuries that followed, there would no longer be room for the open, airy villas of the past. The future looked more like Spalato than Piazza Armerina. Still, this doesn't mean the ideas used at Piazza Armerina disappeared completely. As mentioned earlier, there's a connection between Spalato and pre-Islamic or early Islamic desert palace fortresses in Syria, like Qasr ibn Wardan and Mashhata. Both types of buildings share a main feature, the triconch reception hall, which also links back, directly or indirectly, to Constantinople. In fact, two key elements that later became common in imperial palace architecture were already present at Piazza Armerina: the triconch and the semicircular columned courtyard called a sigma, named after the Greek capital letter S, which looked like the Latin letter C at the time. One of the best-known examples is Emperor Theophilos's 829 to 842 addition of a triconch and sigma to the Great Palace in Constantinople. Even documents from 447 mention a triconch building in the city, probably an official structure. And excavations of a palace from 416 to 418 show a large complex of round and multi-lobed rooms opening off a sigma-shaped court. In Ravenna, east of the church of S. Apollinare Nuovo, a poorly excavated large structure includes a peristyle, an apsed reception hall, and a triconch layout. Since Ravenna became the seat of the imperial court from 404 onward, this building is often considered to be Theodoric's palace, though without firm proof, it should still be viewed in that context. So, while Piazza Armerina may be one of the last examples of the old type of social villa, architecturally, it actually points ahead to major future developments in ceremonial public buildings. Between these two extremes, Spalato's fortified residence and Piazza Armerina's open luxury villa, stood the valuable experience of the previous 50 years, which certainly influenced Constantine and his advisors. This experience had been gathered in cities like Antioch, Nicomedia, Thessaloniki, Sirmium, Milan, and Trier. In the late architecture of these places, old distinctions between East and West, between capitals and provinces, and even between provinces themselves, began to lose meaning. By the early 4th century, the ancient world had almost achieved a cosmopolitan style of architecture that stretched across a vast area with a shared identity. Constantinople looked ready to become the ultimate monument of that tradition. But history took a different course. Although Constantinople was founded at the end of a long period moving toward cultural and architectural unity, it developed in the opposite direction. The classical world was beginning to break apart. The split between East and West, the fall of Roman control in the West, and the rise of Islam pushed Byzantine civilization to turn inward. As its ties with the West grew weaker, Byzantium relied more on its Greek heritage, and Christianity gave it a deeply religious and imperial identity. Even though Byzantine architecture served a very different world with new values and needs, it still remained deeply connected to its past. That past was the architecture of the late pagan Roman Empire.